wrecking yard. I met my true love down in the wrecking yard. I met my true love called a wreck Chevrolet, which I see every day.
Hi, welcome to the first of several new installments of The Wrecking Yard. My name is Tony. I'm still the head cheese around here. Before I get started, I would like to thank everybody who made my recent southern sojourn possible. I couldn't have done it without your help. It was work I wanted to get done, but just wasn't within my financial grasp to do it. And you all made it possible. Today's guest is Bob Mehr, the New York Times best-selling author of Trouble Boys, The True Story of the Replacements. Honestly, it's one of the great rock bios I think I've ever read. My uncle said it was a handbook on how to not be in a band, and I can't really disagree with him. Even if you didn't like the Replacements, hell, even if you didn't like music, just the story is so compelling. It's also the third book, if anyone's keeping track, to mention me or to quote me, and none of them have been true crime novels, so I got that going for me. Bob is also a contributor to Mojo magazine. He's the associate editor, or an associate editor, on the website by NWR, which I can't recommend highly enough, but I'll warn you, if you go there, you better set aside an afternoon, because that's how long you're going to be there. He's also the music writer for the Commercial Appeal, the Memphis newspaper, and he's sort of become the de facto archivist for the Replacements, being responsible for the Live at Maxwell's CD that came out a few years ago, and the recent Dead Man's Pop box set. I have to say, pretty fucking remarkable. I don't think that anybody's favorite Replacements album was Don't Tell a Soul, but this new version, which is actually, I guess, an old version, just sounds so much different. It has hills, it has valleys, it doesn't sound like the corners have been sanded down. I know that doesn't make much sense, but that's how I'm going to put it anyway. If you get a chance to hear it and you're familiar with Don't Tell a Soul, I think you'll be flabbergasted at the difference. It really is a completely different record. And we talk about this quite a bit in the podcast, which took place at the offices of the Commercial Appeal newspaper. It was the first time I'd ever been in a actual newsroom, which was pretty exciting. If you should happen to hear a third voice on the podcast, that would be the Wrecking Yard intern, Memphis Woody. We thank him for his help as well, taking photographs and sort of helping keeping things organized. I again want to thank everybody who made this possible and let you know that there are more episodes coming down the pike, and I think you're going to like them. So without any further ado, here is me, and I love saying this, New York Times best-selling author Bob Mehr.
So unfortunately, this is the only copy I have. Whether I wasn't giving one, I haven't got my shipment.
This was on my list of things to ask about, actually.
So yeah, it's coming out not this week, but next week. And so I don't know how much you know about it, but basically it's like, we did the whole archival dig thing, and
it's bad timing considering that I already pre-ordered Abbey Road.
Yeah,
and Arthur is my favorite Kinks album, so it's really bad. Well, and that Gene Clark thing that they just announced.
Clark thing, and then also really the Ramones expensive. Alive. There's all kinds of
yeah. What they're trying to do is they're trying to make us buy them for the third or fourth time by making them extra deluxe.
Extra deluxe. Well, this is at least the Replacements can claim.
Nice.
This is only the first time they've goosed people on this, really.
Well, Warner Brothers hasn't really.
Well, the band hasn't either really kind of let it happen. I mean, it's pretty amazing for a band that is as popular, relatively speaking, and well-known and whatever, influential. They really haven't done anything with their catalog. There's a kind of Warner-era greatest hits in 97. There was just a general best of with 2 new songs in 2006, so they're 10 years apart. And then the album reissues, which, good Lord, you need that at some point. So they did that 10, 11 years ago. So the stuff that I've been involved with is the live record that came out in 2017, Live at Maxwell's, which was an archival piece, but actually new that people hadn't heard. And then this, which is almost all unreleased or unreleased versions.
Yeah, I can see.
So, and we did really well with Maxwell's. I mean, it sold, between us, like 40,000 copies, something crazy for, without any real push or anything like that. So we thought we'd get a little more ambitious with this one. So hopefully we'll do a few more where there's worthwhile stuff, and there is still some really cool unreleased stuff. So problem with them is like
have they dug those tapes out of the river?
Yeah, those they didn't really throw anything valuable. This was funny. We found these tapes. Technically the spark for this was they were making this record. They were finishing up at Paisley Park in the fall of '88, and they absconded with a bunch of tapes from Paisley Park. Nobody knew about that, and they stashed them. And Slim Dunlap had him in his basement for 30 years, and he had a stroke about 5-6 years ago, and his wife a few years back was cleaning out the basement and found these tapes in a cupboard.
Really?
I was like, I don't know what these are. Most of them were just kind of rough mixes and stuff, but there was the full session with Tom Waits that they did when they were making this record. Just kind of a drunken night out, but very fun. And then the real sort of thing was Matt Wallace, the producer, who didn't get to mix the record. He had tried to do a kind of quick mix, which so I went and got him, brought him back here. We actually transferred him at Ardent, coincidentally enough, and then hearing Matt's original vision, though it was hurried and incomplete because he mixed the whole record in like an afternoon, as a way to get an audition to mix it, and they just were going to go with the pro guy that they had hired, but it sounded so different that we're like, well, you can do a whole. The version of the record the band made was never released, and so now this is it. So
this looks great.
He had to clean it up a bit, and just on a technical thing. So he kind of went back into the tapes in the spring and did it. But yeah, it's a very cool.
Check that out.
Yeah,
really nice. It's a nice package.
Excuse me, Bob, do you mind if I take a couple pictures during interviews? Just so
of course. Sorry, it's not anywhere more scenic.
No, this is
no
cool.
worries.
Well, the first thing I want to do is apologize. I think because my mind is kind of fuzzy on this, but I think you might have contacted me.
I did. I think we spoke.
Did. Was it through MySpace?
I could have been
see,
that
that's
far back.
That's what I was telling him.
I thought it was Facebook by then, because really by the time I was doing anything serious with the book, it would have been Facebook era as opposed to MySpace. But I might have at one point.
Because the thing was, I thought it was MySpace, and it was right around the time when me, along with everybody else, was kind of backing away from MySpace, and I just think I stopped checking.
It could have been. It could have been. I reached out. I mean, I don't know if you want to record this.
That's fine.
Yeah,
That's fine.
But it was. I think the reason I reached out to you in the beginning was it must have been in some message board discussion. I saw you chime in with the story about when you had met Bob Stinson.
Several times.
Yeah.
I was in a band. We opened for them 3 times.
Right. And yeah. Anyway, you had some story, and I thought, the funny thing about the whole Replacements thing is they very rarely were ever confrontational with each other or conversational even. So when it came to Bob's departure from the band and sort of anecdotal, I was relying on a lot of anecdotal stuff he said to his wife, stuff he said to other friends, and in some cases things he said to people on the road or bands he opened with or people he played with. And you had the one quote about how he said, I'm not even on that record talking about Tim.
It was so weird.
And it was a rare moment of kind of candor from him to a relative stranger or whatever, and so I think I just thought, well, I got to find that out. So I can
elaborate on that a little bit too, because that was the first time. Well, okay, I'll back that up. That was not the first time they came to town. The first time they came to Indianapolis, they played outside on a sidewalk in front of a used clothing store called Modern Times.
Was that the one that had been a Taco Bell previously, or
No.
That's
Muggins.
Right.
That's the third stop we make here. And then the second time they played at this place called the Patio, and that's where we opened up for them. I was in a band called the Math Bats.
Right.
And we opened up for them. And we saw Bob. He wasn't hanging out with the band. The 3 guys were overdoing whatever it is they were doing, and he was sort of sitting at a table looking kind of sad and nursing a beer. And we were like, well, we should go over there and say hi. So we're like, pleasant little, the Replacements are in town, woohoo! So we go and sit down. We were probably fairly uncool, and we're just talking. Hey, how's it going, Bob? Blah 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 blah. And he's talking, but he's not saying a lot of words.
Right.
And finally we go, how's the new album coming along? And that's when he said, I don't know, I'm not fucking on it.
All right.
And we just went like, what do we say to that?
Right.
We didn't know, because from where we were sitting, they looked like they got along just fine. They played well together. They never played any drunken, shitty shows in Indianapolis. The 3 times that they played in Indianapolis, all 3 times they were in good shape. They played nice and tight, and it sounded great. Right. So, all those drunken shows, this is back in the days when I would trade tapes with people through the mail. I was big into that.
Right.
And the rumors started going around like, oh my God, they played this one show where Bob
Right.
just sat down and cried for the whole show.
Right.
My uncle saw that one.
Right.
And I finally got a tape of it, and I was like, oh my God, those shows really do exist.
Yeah, and it's not like it is now where every moment of every band's life is documented or talked about or whatever on somebody's phone. So, and as I say, their internal communication was pretty limited, and weirdly, even though they seemed like a very confrontational band amongst each other, they were very non-confrontational. So, in kind of depicting his sort of movement away from the band, I had to rely on a lot of people who might get these fleeting glimpses of truth from Bob. And you were one of them, and it's just, I don't know, like I say, I just, the weird thing, you're just scrolling down the internet and you see this, and I was like, oh, that's a, kind of a little flashpoint.
And like I say, I encountered them several times, and they were never mean to us or unfriendly or anything. Yeah. But after reading the book, I'm rereading it now, but after reading the book, I realized that Paul Westerberg wasn't being combative or jerky or anything like that. I think it was just a combination of the shyness and the alcohol.
Yeah.
And and I've known people like that. The first time REM played Indianapolis, they played at a gay bar, and it was funny because we get there and there's like all these posters of like guys blowing each other and stuff like all around this room, and they let me be the DJ for the show, which also the DJ booth also happened to be their dressing room.
God.
Oh, Michael Stipe sat in a corner on the floor with his head between his knees like this for the entire. He didn't say a word to us, not a word. The other guys were like, "Hey man, what records you got? Hey, look, can you play this one?" Blah, blah. And he just like didn't say a word. And then when they got out, they were like a cyclone. They like blew up.
Right.
Like
it's funny.
We're looking down and we're like going, damn, they're really energetic compared to that EP. And their manager's standing behind us, and he looks down and he goes, yeah, they gave us a bunch of Coke before the show. And then he just kind of ducked back and left.
Yeah, sometimes those frontmen, you think they're in the spotlight for a reason, but they probably don't belong there. You know what I mean? That's definitely the case with Westerberg.
Well, what was funny is I had a friend of mine who was filming it, because this was back in the days when you would sneak a video camera into somewhere and try to film it. But they kept moving forward and forward and forward. And so, like, if you see the original videotape, it's only like 6 or 7 songs before they get so close you can't film anymore. And just like, like this. And he was like, oh, shit, I can't do
I feel
this.
like I could be imagining there's a not great quality bootleg of the Replacements video from maybe 87 or 8. Yeah, it has to be 87.
Is it from Cincinnati?
Maybe it's Cincinnati.
I shot that.
Is it? I thought it was from Indiana. Yeah, maybe it's the Bogarts.
Yeah, we were up in the balcony, and the Replacements were particularly fussy about video.
Unfortunately.
So we just set it on the. It doesn't move. We just set it on the balcony.
But it was kind of in a
Well, actually, no. There might have been another one because they played like Bloomington, Indiana. Like
maybe that's what it is.
Before.
There's a Bloomington
one. And I did
one.
that one too, and it's kind of shaky because I had to keep hiding it.
Yeah.
Did you ever go to record conventions back in the 80s?
Yeah.
And you see those tables of guys with like videotapes?
Yeah, there's like
that was me. I did that for almost a decade.
Wow, really?
And if there's any shows that were filmed in Indianapolis, Cincinnati, Columbus, or Chicago, chances are pretty good it was me.
Did you actually ever get any ones that were probably also too is probably the equipment was like you were shooting with like a regular video camera, right?
I had a secret. My secret was because they were big and they were bulky. I would take them apart as much as possible. Right. And I had a girl that would always go with me, and I always had to buy her ticket and make sure that she had drinks, and that was the only thing she charged me. And she had this big ass purse, and we'd like put all the little pieces inside like little makeup boxes and whatever, and we'd take the main bulk of the camera and put it in a Kotex box, and then we'd like stack all this stuff on top of it. And so there's not a security man in the world. I don't care how big and burly. And imagine they'll go digging through the dig, and the minute their fingers touch that Kotex box, they go, you're in. And so I only got caught twice. Once at Billy Joel, which I didn't even want to be there. Some guy paid me to do it.
Right.
And I was just like, I hate Billy Joel. I'm not in it. And it was horrible. I was glad I got caught because I was out of there like in a half hour. But they caught me because they saw my red light from the camera. And then Pink Floyd, I couldn't get it in because they had a security guard that wasn't afraid of a Kotex box.
Right.
So other than that, I always got it in.
Have you ever read that book Bootleg by Clinton Halen?
Yes.
Yeah. So it's like I really think that's that world, that era. So it seems so like almost quaint now with
everything. Well, I used to be a major tape trader. Not only was I trading cassettes, but I was like trading videotapes with people overseas. I had to buy a PAL TV and a PAL. I was actually transferring them at home.
Oh wow.
With that, you remember the old way people used to do it, where they would like set up a camera and film the
the
PAL
PAL
TV,
TV, yeah.
so you get that sort of flash.
Right, yeah.
But that was the best you could get, you
Yeah.
know. But anyway, I meant to tell you, the third time the Replacements came to town, that was the show where they refused to go on. They were under the understanding that Bill Levin, the promoter, would have cocaine waiting for them when they got there.
Right.
Yeah, and he didn't. And so they told him flat out, they said, we are not playing unless you get us cocaine. And, you know, he was like, he literally left for a while. He had to, like, go find some. And then
It's on the rider.
Yeah, this was the place that used to be a Taco Bell.
Oh, right.
Or it was a taco restaurant of some sort. And the windows were so huge that it was almost like it didn't have a front wall at all. It was like a giant window in the front. And Bob, he kept looking at it like this. He was like going, I'm going to throw my guitar through that window.
It's too tempting.
And he kept saying it, like all night. He kept saying, I'm going to throw my guitar through that window. He never did, but he kept saying it. And that was the night that I opened for them twice. I was playing with the Math Bats, and then also an original, a really early lineup of the Vulgar Boatmen.
Oh, yeah.
Do you know them?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that was funny too, because I forget one of them, but one of the times the promoter told me that when he was talking to Paul on the phone, he was like, well, you know, we got this show, blah, 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 blah. And he said, who's opening? He goes, oh, the Math Bats. And he goes, oh, those fuckers again? But I don't know if he meant us or if he meant the Vulgar Boatmen.
Right.
I have no idea, or even if he knew what he was talking about at all.
Right.
So, and that was the night that Peter Buck and Mike Mills showed up.
Mm-hmm.
They were
recording
yeah. Life's Rich Pageant downtown.
Right.
They showed up and they remembered me. They were like, "Hey, weren't you the DJ in the gay bar?" I'm like, "Yeah, that was me." Yeah. So that's that. And I don't remember after that show at Muggins. I think the only time they came back to Indiana, to my knowledge, is when they played Bloomington.
Yeah.
And then
maybe with Petty or something through.
Yeah. And then the last time I saw them was that Cincinnati.
Yeah,
show
I don't think on that last tour they got
87.
any closer than Cincinnati, probably.
Yeah.
Anyway. So were you just want to talk about the book? Or
Well, actually, no. I don't know if you've heard any of the other ones.
I heard,
but
yeah.
basically, I just like to talk about music with people who
Yeah.
like to talk about music.
Sure.
So I'd like to find out, first, how did you end up in Memphis being from Los Angeles? Because that's sort of the opposite of where it usually is.
Are we okay? So
Yeah, we've been taping this whole
cool.
time.
Well, yeah, I was basically, I'm from LA. We moved when I was just about to start in high school to Arizona, to Tucson. Just my folks moved out there, so I moved with them.
Right.
Which was good because it probably gave me a different kind of raising that I would otherwise staying in LA. Did high school and college out there. Didn't really think I was going to be a music critic. I was in communications was my sort of major, which I don't know what I would have done with that. Maybe gone into advertising or something. And then I moved to Phoenix, kind of working in broadcasting, only for about a year. I mean, I got my first real music critic job, music editor of the Alt Weekly in Phoenix when I was 22 or 23, so like pretty young. I wrote this story about Doug Hopkins, who had been the guitarist in the Gin Blossoms, who killed himself, got kicked out, and later killed himself. And I did a story on the 50th anniversary of his death in '98, and it's the first time anybody had really done anything kind of significant on him, and I really got hired off the back of that, freelance story. And so that, I had really only intended to write that one story because I had encountered him when I was sort of underage and visiting Tempe, and sort of he was a kind of larger than life figure, sort of a weird combination actually of Paul and Bob, Paul Westerberg and Bob Stinson, in terms of he was a songwriter but also a guitarist but also sort of doomed wild man and all that sort of stuff. And so I just kind of really wanted to write this one story. This is a long way of answering your question, but I did that. Got the job working for the New Times paper out there, which was, at that point, alternative weeklies were thriving. This was still, the internet was going, but it hadn't really sort of taken the bite out of the media business. So that to me was like a dream job. I thought I'd stay there for the rest of my life. I'd stayed for a few years, went to the Village Voice paper in Seattle, met a gal, and decided to move to Chicago, and then I got a job at the Alt Weekly there, Chicago Reader, and was there for a few years into the mid-2000s, and then broke up with a girl, decided I didn't really have anything keeping me in Chicago, and this job offer came in Memphis to be the music critic at the Daily paper, what was then a Scripps owned newspaper. Since then we've changed hands a couple times and are now owned by Gannett and USA Today. But I thought, having grown up out west and mostly worked out west with the exception of Chicago, but a big city in the north, I never thought I'd be in the South. I hadn't even really visited the South, I don't think, at that point, other than maybe Texas. So it was sort of a leap of faith, but it turned out to be the best thing I did. And part of why I did it was, music critic gigs, daily music critic gigs were pretty rare as hen's teeth. But also I thought, Memphis, it's not a disposable beat. You know what I mean? It's not just arts here. It's much of the economy is predicated on it. The whole civic identity is predicated on music. So I figured it would be a safe bet, and it has been for coming up on 13 years of being at the paper, and it's been pretty amazing. It's somewhat grim, but I've sort of unfortunately buried a lot of really amazing Memphis musicians here, written their obituaries and sort of broken news of their death. But at the same time, I've got to do stuff that you just wouldn't do, and I mean from hanging out with Roland Janes, who was Jerry Lee's guitarist and was a Sun Session man at the Phillips studio, getting to know the Phillips family, getting to know all the great studios, Boo Mitchell, Willie Mitchell, like all the folks at Ardent. I mean, it's sort of, for a music lover coming to Memphis, it's been a dream. And most of the time I've been here since '06, really '07, I started working, or at least trying to get the Replacements book, Trouble Boys, off the ground. So that's kind of paralleled most of my time here. So it's been a great, that's how I got to Memphis, as the song goes.
Yeah, well, that's why I love Memphis. I mean, I just like having music around me all the time, and you can get that here without actually even trying.
Well, I tell you, the story I tell people is like, all this stuff is like, occasionally we'll go out east to East Memphis where the Whole Foods is, and I will occasionally see Sam the Sham in the Whole Foods, in the aisle, sort of shimmying around. It's like, I don't know where else you can go and say, yeah, Sam the Sham shops at my supermarket.
So how long did it take you to get acclimated to the humidity?
Well, I'm used to having lived in Arizona a long time. I'm used to a dry heat, so it was pretty crazy. Although I spent enough time in Chicago, enough summers anywhere, the 2-3 years I was there, that I was somewhat ready for it. And at least everyone here has air conditioning, unlike in Chicago's, central air. In Chicago, you're still dealing with room units, so in some ways it hasn't been as bad, sort of adjusting to the climate here.
Right. Now, have you always been a music guy?
Yes, I mean, I love film and books and all that sort of stuff, but I'm not a math and science guy. Didn't do well in those subjects.
Yeah,
I always I always say I took the pre-SAT. In those days, that was a big deal. I don't know if it still is, and it was like I scored in the 98th percentile in verbal, and like the 10th, in the 10 percentile in math. So I had a long ways to go to even it up to get into school, but I did. So I mean, I've always been more about arts and music and stuff. And
now, how old are you? Do you mind me asking?
I'm 44.
Okay, so I'm a little older than you. I graduated in '79, and at that point, you didn't have to go to college. Everybody told you, well, as long as you got a high school diploma, you're going to be fine.
Right.
And then like 3 or 4 years later, it was like, God damn, I got to have a college diploma. And by then, I was like already out and doing stuff.
And now I don't know if it's worth as much. It's sort of like in the 80s and 90s, everyone said you had to go to college.
You guys kind of come back around now that maybe if you just have a trade that you're really good at.
Or, you're a computer programmer or whatever, you write software or code, you don't really need to go to... but I was thankful. I mean, my university education was not. I did like the really foolish thing, sort of being, even though I'm not Catholic, I'm probably Catholic by nature because I feel guilty. So I was taking my first year at the University of Arizona. I was taking media arts classes, which is sort of fancy word for criticism, really. Cultural criticism or pop culture criticism. And I was in a 100 level class, but with some 300 students where they were kind of doing a split class. And it was my first sort of college experience, and I wrote a paper. I think it was basically like a review or analysis of the Wonder Years, that TV show. Mm-hmm. And the professor, who was a pretty cold character, like held my paper up and said, well, this is really great, and this is better than any, So I was like, normally people are like, oh, I should gravitate towards that. I thought, well, this is too easy. School's supposed to be hard. Right. So I dropped out of media arts and got into the communication program, which is much more about sort of human communication and that kind of stuff, and like nonverbal thing. Sort of the secret stuff that advertising people eventually, learned to sell things to you. And so I sort of got out of that, and that's what I pursued. But most of my college education was, they had a really great library at the U of A, and I got to take film classes and that kind of stuff. So my real education that actually prepared me in some ways for what I ended up doing really didn't have anything to do with my major or the curriculum as such.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you were a kid, what kind of music did you listen to? What like hit you hard?
Well, I had a really kind of unusual thing growing up in LA at the time. Basically in the 80s, the early 80s to the end of the 80s when we were there, My first exposure to music then, as was most people, was a lot of radio stuff. My parents liked music, but they weren't big record guys. My dad is, even though they were sort of hippies, hippie era living in Berkeley, my dad always liked Nat King Cole. He liked gentle, easy listening kind of music, romantic stuff. Was not, a little Paul Simon. That was about as edgy as he got. And my mom sort of listened to whatever he listened to. So there wasn't a lot of music from my folks. But my uncle, actually, who recently just passed, he was a big music fan, 60s stuff, and so that was a kind of driving force. And then the other thing was the radio in Los Angeles at that time. There was an AM station, KRLA, which had been a kind of pop station in the 60s, now had turned into an oldie station, but a really good oldie station because this was the mid 80s, so they played 50, 55, 54 to 68. Like they would play Stones, but they wouldn't play anything after Jumpin' Jack Flash, or maybe not even that. Honky Tonk Women, Jumpin' Jack Flash was the. Sorry. Let me pause. Let me turn that off. There you go. So KRLA was, as I say, was this oldie station, and the other weird thing about it, they were resuscitating the oldies format. Had a lot of big personalities. Had like the real Don Steele, who was a DJ. They had Wolfman Jack on in the afternoons or evenings. So as a 10, 11-year-old kid, my DJs were on this oldies station. Was Real Don Steele and Wolfman Jack playing oldies. So I kind of had that 50s, 60s growing up. I used to literally call up Wolfman Jack and request songs on the air, and he would be, I'd be talking to him. So it was the kind of weird American Graffiti sort of musical raising, but in the heart of the 80s. And then, of course, I was exposed to a lot of, whatever was the big 80s stuff. I was fortunate in that we had a neighbor when I was a kid a guy named Joe Rojo, and his older brother, this is in the 80s, everybody was listening to Van Halen and, Dio and Scorpions or whatever, was Judas Priest, and for whatever reason he was a Mexican-American guy, and his older brother, who was a big influence on him, and then he was a little influence on me, they were the hugest Cheap Trick fans. So the first new record I ever bought was Cheap Trick, Next Position Please. So, I could have gone, that was like, I wanted to be like these guys, so I really got into Cheap Trick early, and so I think as far as mainstream, rock radio stuff, that was a pretty good path, a little bit more.
Sure, you could do a lot worse.
You could do a lot worse, and it led to, I think, having that as the kind of foundational, band for me, made it a lot easier and maybe more receptive to things like the Replacements early on, or kind of the kind of music that I actually ended up liking,
Well, I have a funny Cheap Trick story, actually, is that we saw them like in 77, and they were amazing.
I'm sure.
I mean, they were just like so good. But like
still amazing.
Actually, I just saw them in like 2006, 2007, and Robin Zander could still hit those high notes.
Yeah.
And I think he's one of the most underrated rock vocalists ever.
For sure.
No, he's never in the conversation. It's always Dio, 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 and you're like going, no.
No.
But anyway, so it was like in the early 90s. They played Cincinnati one night, and they played Indianapolis the next night. So we're like, fuck it, we'll go to both shows. So we drove, because Cincinnati's only an hour and a half.
Right.
So we drove there, and I'm videotaping the show, and it's a great show. I'm up front, no one's caught me. I'm getting all the action. They're playing hot. And then I see Ken Adamany on the side, and he's doing this. He's pointing in my direction like this, and I see some guy comes running out, takes me out front. They take the tape. I'm like, okay, whatever. Well, the next day I was actually working the show in Indianapolis, and they had me go pick up Bunny at the airport. So I go and I pick up Bunny at the airport, and Ken Adamany is there. Or no, he was there at the venue once we got back, and he looked at me and he goes, "Were you in Cincinnati last night?" And I was like, "Cincinnati? Why would I drive to Cincinnati when you guys are right here in my neighborhood?" And he was like, "Okay," like that, and that was like the end of it. But I kind of
sweating for a second.
I kind of dodged a bullet there. Yeah, and we didn't try to tape it that night either. We were just like, we knew we'd get caught.
So so that was kind of my musical rooting, was this weird combination of 80s radio, having a neighbor who I was kind of trying to impress who was into Cheap Trick, so I got into Cheap Trick. And then I had some older cousins who were into kind of, I guess, edgier sort of, because she's an edgier personality, my cousin Steph, and she liked Elvis Costello and things like that. And then, just being in LA, reading the LA Times coverage of music, every Sunday I'd get the calendar section, which was like a big sort of deal even as a kid, reading that. And there was a lot of movie stuff, a lot of show stuff, like the calendar section in the Sundays, LA Times in the 80s was amazing. And so a lot of the music coverage there, Robert Hilburn, he was really tight with Warner Brothers, so all the classic Warner stuff, I hear about, just even if I hadn't heard it, I would read about it. So that stuff was in my was in my kind of wheelhouse. And then just by total coincidence, 86, we were still living in LA, and happened to, because I was watching Saturday Night Live, and was, I think at that point, kind of a fan of, I like some John Hughes movies. I think Weird Science was out, maybe Breakfast Club. I like Anthony Michael Hall, and Anthony Michael Hall was a cast member that year, notoriously sort of bad year for Saturday Night Live. And so I happened to be watching, I think my grandmother was babysitting me and my younger sister, and I saw the Replacement's famous performance on Saturday Night Live in early 86. And, you know, I've probably said it before, but like for me, at least for a kid who didn't have access to bootleg videos and things like that, there was not a lot of rock and roll on TV. There was pop music. I mean, there was Solid Gold and things like that. And this was sort of after the era of Don Kirshner's rock concert and after the era of Midnight Special. I kind of pretty much missed that, or maybe caught the very tail end of it, but it was not present. So to see a loud, sort of somewhat messy, uncontrollable rock band in 1986, what to a kid who had never seen Kiss and New York Dolls on rock concert or whatever, had a visceral sort of effect. I mean, I remember thinking, it was just so unkempt compared to know, pristine pop, big 80s pop, and the presentations you'd see on MTV. I guess by that point MTV had some like live concerts they would do periodically, but for the most part it was a pretty, controlled, precise era in music. And to see like these guys who looked weird, to my young eyes, and who sounded loud and messy, and even if you watch the tape, they come on really loud because they had turned their amps back up and they popped the sound back down. It was just something wonderfully off-putting about seeing that. So I kind of, I remember the name. I didn't immediately go buy the record. I was like, I guess at that point 11 or 12, but a year, 18 months later, by that point we were just 87. We moved to end of 87. We moved to Arizona, and I was starting high school essentially in 88, and that's when I got Pleased to Meet Me, and really kind of got in and started working my way back. And
so that was your first one?
Yes, the first record I really heard was Pleased to Meet Me. Although I'd heard some of the songs in Tim, I guess, on the performance, but and kind of worked my way back. But at the same time, I was also really wasn't big into country music then, but I loved Dwight Yoakam, who's still one of my favorite, artists. And so kind of started getting into country on one hand and sort of alternative indie rock on the other through high school, as you do. And of course, once you get to high school, there's a lot more sort of exposure as far as music, especially in, even in those days. So I started hearing whatever was the kind of, I never was big into, I like the Smiths, but I wasn't into Depeche Mode or things like that. But that era of The Cure, Depeche Mode, when I was in high school, those were the big kind of edgy alternative bands,
Now you mentioned earlier an uncle.
Yeah.
Did you have like a cool uncle that slipped records to you?
I had the best uncle. It's so funny you say this.
Okay, because we're going to compare uncle stories.
Yeah, well, he wasn't so much like records, but he would take me, he was always like buying me stuff, or if I wanted, I remember when the Monkees came back in 86, I was in the Monkees, he took me to, Rhino to go get the Monkees tapes, because it was like an exciting thing, and he was a huge influence. He was a journalist. He actually worked for CNN. He was a bureau chief in the Middle East. Like I said, he literally just passed last month. So I'm just back actually from his services and kind of doing some family stuff. So it's funny you ask about this. But yeah, no, huge, kind of really the biggest in terms of music, film, culture, the biggest, and journalism in my career. I mean, he was sort of like a second father to me, even though my own father's amazing. But my own dad's in real estate and business, and this was kind of the cool uncle. So yeah.
So you didn't have an older brother?
I didn't have an older brother. I'm the oldest of two.
Yeah, see, I'm the oldest too, and I didn't have an older brother.
Yeah, and I didn't have any older male cousins either. Like I said, my cousin Steph, who I grew up with, she was older. But I was the oldest son, really. I mean, I actually have an older cousin, but he lived all the other side of the country, and the family had divorced, so I wasn't really in my life. So my kind of male figure with the cool records, in the absence of brothers and stuff, or with the cool taste anyway, was my uncle.
Yeah. So I had an uncle who used to give me stacks of records when I was little.
Oh,
I mean, I'm like 6, 7, 8 years old,
sure.
And he's like going, here's Having a Rave Up with the Yardbirds. You'll like this.
Oh wow, yeah.
I mean, stuff like that.
Yeah.
And he would also he had a drum set, and whenever I visit my grandma's house, which is where he lived, I would go in there and play and slam on his drums. And I was really stupid. I thought that if I put on headphones, they couldn't hear me. I used to like to play along with Strawberry Fields Forever because it was slow enough that I could do it. And I remember flipping through his records and seeing Trout Mask Replica, and it scared the shit out of me. I was like, I did not like that album cover. I was like, no, like this. But But yeah, he would slip me records all the time, and sort of my punk rock awakening is because of him. Are you familiar with a band from Indiana called MX80 Sound?
Oh yeah, right.
He was their original drummer.
Oh wow.
So yeah,
Well,
and
that's a weird thing. We just, as a sideline, I work for there's a film director named Nicholas Winding Refn, a Danish film director.
Sure, I know.
Yeah,
Well, I
Dry
don't know
and all
him,
this.
but I know him.
Yeah, and he started this website. Jimmy McDonough, who wrote the Neil Young bio,
I
is
know
a
him
buddy
too.
of mine.
He used to make fun of me.
But,
I'm gonna have him on someday.
I have to get this there. But anyway, so I worked for the site with Refn and Jimmy, and one of the projects we've been doing is we've got a volume of it that's up now. About punk, you know, in all its many sort of forms, and we've got an MX80 story and remembers that Steve Albini's written for us. So kind of a small world that you mentioned that.
Well,
but anyway.
my uncle he quit MX80 because he decided he wanted to be an artist, and he moved to New York, and he came back after he was looking for an apartment, and he told me, he goes, hey look, he says, I saw this band called the Ramones. If you ever see the album. And this was like a good year before the album came out. He says, if you ever see the album, just go ahead and buy it. Just go ahead.
That's a good
You're
tip.
going to like it.
That's a good tip.
And like a year or two later, I'm going to the beauty shop with my mom. I got a little bit of money, and there's a record store next door. So I go in, and I'm like, all right, I got $5, and the album was $4.81, which made it with tax $5 even. So I got it, took it home, put on the first song, and I'm going like, I'm a little confused. I'm like going, okay, I guess. They don't look like Uriah Heep, but I guess they rock. You know, so I put on the second song, and it sounded so similar to the first one.
You thought it was the first one?
I thought that I might have got a defective copy. And so I put on the third one, and I'm like going, God damn, they put the same song on every groove. Maybe I got to take this back. And finally, my ears caught the difference.
Yeah.
And by the end of the night, like I'd listen to 4 or 5 times, by the end of the night, I'm like jumping up and down on my bed.
Rewired your
I'm
hearing.
getting at all these albums I don't want anymore, you know, and stuff. And then I went to visit my uncle in New York. Well, actually, back this up. Right before he moved to New York, he took me to Bloomington, and I sat in the living room while MX80 practiced.
Oh, wow.
It was the first time I'd ever seen a live.
Wow.
They were the first live band I ever saw that close.
Well, you win on cool points.
Well, my first concert was the Osmonds at the
Okay.
State Fair. But they were the first. I mean, it was the first time I'd been inside a same room with instruments.
Yeah, that's a
And, man,
pretty
they were-
profound experience.
they
to,
were
like,
loud.
And of all the bands to go see like that.
Well, here's the
Wow.
funny thing. We were there for a long time, and they had a copy of Hollywood Babylon on the coffee table. So I'm sitting there reading Hollywood Babylon. I'm like 13.
Right.
You know, and I've got this.
The Hollywood Babylon, you got MX80 playing 2 feet from you.
It was one of those nights where you're like a different person the day after.
Absolutely,
You know?
absolutely.
So, and then I saw them a couple more times. I did a podcast with them out in San Francisco. They're really nice.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I don't remember having that experience, like, you know, because I was just because of the radio and because of this oldies radio and because of the influence of my uncle and just hearing, you know, I kind of came up that way. It's like I heard the Beatles and the Stones as though that were current, and then I worked my way back hearing Chuck Berry and all that stuff, and then the other stuff started coming in at all angles.
Right.
I do remember when I was a kid, very young, hearing, I had a transistor radio, and I remember probably hearing for the first time something sort of identifiably country music and kind of mythologizing in the way I heard the live version of Waylon Jennings' Bob Wills Is Still the King, and that's still one of my favorite, that live record, the expanded version especially, is like amazing. But I remember that being like, okay, this is different than anything I had known previously. But yeah, for me, I was lucky in that it was a really golden era of oldies, and so like, you know, I mean, who doesn't love oldies? But, you know,
Well, see, I was
what was
lucky.
considered oldies then.
Yeah,
is
because
different
oldies
now.
for me is just what I had. I was born in '61.
Right.
My parents were both really young. They got married when they were 18.
Wow.
So they had like records, good records.
Right.
You know, and plus we had a radio station that, you know, you go on the way to Grandma's, you know, you got an hour of listening to the Kinks and the Stones and the Beatles and Herman's Hermits and all this stuff, you know. So that was just stuff that was around me, and I grew up thinking that was normal music.
Right.
And then around 1968 or so, the first oldie station started
Right.
in Indianapolis, and that, of course, my mom gravitated to that. So all of a sudden, I'm hearing Chuck Berry and Jerry Lee Lewis and stuff. So I got a pretty well-rounded education between my mom and what my uncle was giving me and what I was listening to. Now, the first 45 I ever bought was Candyman by Sammy Davis Jr. and So Nice to Be With You by Gallery.
Well, you're always a product of your era, and I don't escape the 80s totally, but because I had this little different sort of pocket where that my first and foremost thing was not listening to whatever Kiss FM, whatever the pop station was, but more this oldie station, I kind of had a different thing. And the contrast, in terms of feel and production, a kind of just the whatever of, sort of synthesized 80s music and sort of Chuck Berry and early Rolling Stones. I mean, it was, I don't know, I think I always realized there were two different worlds of music, or two different kinds of things. There was a more produced and contemporary current things that are trying to be current and things that were probably pretty timeless, Of course, we're, like I say, everything's relative. It's like you listen to now, if like a kid listening to the 80s, this music was only 15, 18, in most cases less than 20 years old. Right. Now, if you listen to something that's 20 years old, it's not that different. It's kind of dated, but it doesn't feel as different to me as Tears for Fears, which were fine, or whatever sounded like from hearing Chuck Berry.
Sure. Well, see, for me, like in the 70s, the 50s seemed like it was 100 years away, and now I realize that like Nevermind the Bollocks came out like twice as long ago from now as then, and it doesn't seem like it to me.
Right.
And I think of my mom, in the 70s, and like Elvis was only 15 years ago to her.
Right. Right. Yeah. Well, that's the thing. When you're young, time seems like way more distant than it is now. You realize, well, it's not so far off.
Now, did you say you were also a big movie guy?
Yeah. I mean, again, sort of the influence of my uncle, Westerns, and I mean, they always, I don't know if there's a Gore Vidal quote, something about, you find out what movies a man saw between the ages of, 10 and 14, and you kind of tell you what kind of person he is. And I saw a lot of Bogart, Maltese Falcon is probably the movie I watched the most, in that age range, which is this sort of, and that's one of my my other sort of literary things I love, Chandler, Hammett, Ross MacDonald, that kind of stuff. So
I'm really into like the hard-boiled novels.
So pretty much
Charles Willeford and stuff like that.
My tastes have sort of solidified in 1986 at age 11 or 12 and haven't really sort of changed too much, although you find different avenues of it. And Westerns, kind of the more obvious things at the time. There was a lot of things that were run regularly, particularly in L.A. Every year. Like everybody saw Wizard of Oz at Thanksgiving or whatever it was, but they would show Adventures of Robin Hood. They would show Yankee Doodle Dandy. They would show, just kind of a lot of the Warner Brothers. I guess they must have owned the library at that time. This was before Turner owned everything. But so I would see a lot of kind of Warner Brothers stuff. And which is probably kind of my favorite studio of that era, and it's like, is it my favorite because I saw it, or because I'm sort of predisposed to liking that kind of little sort of edgier, tougher sort of stuff? So
I had parents that didn't like to talk to each other, and I had a dad who particularly didn't like to talk to us.
Right.
So his idea, or their idea, of a family night was going to the drive-in.
Oh yeah.
So we used to go to the drive-in sometimes twice a week, like for my entire childhood, and my dad, the times he got into arguing with my mom because he wanted to lock us in the trunk to save money.
Right.
And my mom would go like, "You are not locking my kids in your trunk." Besides that, my dad's other big saying was, they're going to learn about it sooner or later anyway. I don't care.
Right.
I saw Last House on the Left when it came out.
Oh my God.
I was 9. Okay? They took us to a triple feature of The Gruesome Twosome, The Undertaker and His Pals, and Night of the Living Dead. The year the Night of the Living Dead came out, so I would have been 7.
Oh wow.
Okay? I saw tons of shit I should not have seen. I saw Easy Rider when it came out. I saw The Adventurers, which was rated X at the time. And my parents were like, fuck it, how bad can it be?
I have a funny story relating to my same uncle. This would have been like 81, so I was like 81 or 82, 6 or 7. And we decided to go to a drive-in, and I think at this time drive-ins were starting. So we went, I can't remember, it was in the Valley or somewhere. We lived in mostly West Side. So we got a pizza, and we got ice cream, and we were going. Me and him and his girlfriend, later wife, were out there. And because I was a kid, and I think, whatever was on Happy Days, Mork and Mindy, it was a Robin Williams movie. So he's like, Mork and Mindy, it'll be funny. So we go see this movie, and I'm like, what is going on? And it's The World According to Garp.
Oh,
The
shit.
John Irving thing. He didn't I don't think my uncle realized it was going to be, which is quite a provocative and disturbing film in terms of
he
like...
bit off what?
Yeah, exactly. So it was like, very quickly we all realized, I think we stuck it out for it, but it was a really disturbing thing. And I was always like, this was a kind of a funny family story. He's like, yeah, he took me to this thing he didn't realize. And I realized years later, now that everything's on YouTube, I realized the original trailer for it. I saw it. And I was just telling my wife the story, and we looked up, and they did kind of make it seem like a lighthearted sort of comedy in the trailer, probably false advertising or mismarketing there. So anyway, that's his was not intentionally to take me to Last House on the Left.
Oh, my parents just did not care. I saw Bonnie and Clyde like 3 times the year it came out.
Yeah.
Okay, and I was like 8 or 9 maybe.
Right.
But the funny thing about Night of the Living Dead is, so it's a gruesome twosome comes on. It's pretty funny. I'm laughing. It's gory, so I'm like thinking it's cool. Gruesome twosome comes on. It's gory. I'm a big Herschel Gordon Lewis fan at this point.
Wow.
Anyway, so we'll watch that, and it's pretty funny. Then Night of the Living Dead comes on, and it freaks the shit out of me. I'm like, because it looks real.
Right.
It's black and white. It almost looks like a documentary, and I'm like whimpering in the back seat. I'm like, and my mom takes my glasses away. She goes, "Okay, enough." And she takes the glasses off of me. So the rest of the movie, I could just hear it.
Right. That's probably even worse.
It was horrible. So the next day, they had some friends of theirs who had moved there from Kentucky, and they were telling them, they were like going, "Oh man, you would not believe these movies we saw last night. They were the craziest ass thing, blah, 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 blah." An hour later, we're going again. We went again the next night to see the same 3 movies to take these people from Kentucky that my parents knew.
Right.
So we're sitting there, and I tell my mom, I say, "Okay, Mom, look, just let me keep my glasses on. I can do it this time. I can do it." And I kept them on, and that movie still freaked the hell out of me.
Oh, yeah.
But I really loved it, And then you couldn't see it again for like years and years and years.
Well, that was the thing
I
people
was telling
forget.
people,
Yeah.
I was like going, "Dude, I saw this movie once."
The inaccessibility of things in those
eras
eras is something that we were lucky. My dad has always been kind of a tech guy. Had an early TRS-80 Radio Shack home computer, and he had a Quasar, top-loading VHS thing in '78.
Wood panel?
No, I think
Ours
it was
had
maybe
wood
brushed silver,
paneling.
but yeah. But he had a camera, so we have like very early home video footage of me at age, in the late '70s, '78, '79. It's pretty early on. He was kind of one of those guys who always wanted the early technology. But I would watch, sort of films in the early VHS. I mean, I don't even know how much it was even commercially available then. Somehow we got a copy of like a couple different westerns, and I think the first Rocky or whatever. So it's like I just remember being like, it wasn't there, like this. It's funny to have lived in, still being relatively young, but to have lived in an era of almost no accessibility or very limited accessibility to where now everything is on your phone.
Well, when VHS first came out, I mean, it was a godsend to someone. Like, I wanted to see Lawrence of Arabia really bad, and for years and years and years I couldn't.
Right.
And all of a sudden, poof, here it was on a videotape. It wasn't remastered or anything. It looked a little crappy comparatively speaking, but at least I could see it, And then, when VHS first came out, there were some releases that I'm not sure if they were official or not, because there was like a Rolling Stones live in '68, and what was it, like the Marquee, I think?
Yep.
That thing came out and then it disappeared. And then there was like Eraserhead. Trying to get a copy of Eraserhead was how I got started collecting tapes.
Ah, okay.
Because I saw it in New York, and again, I'm telling everyone, dude, you got to see this, and you just couldn't.
Right.
You just couldn't. If you were lucky, you had a theater in town that would occasionally show old movies.
Right.
And we did. They would never last long. We'd have a repertory theater where they'd show lots of old stuff, and we'd catch up on stuff we hadn't seen. Like, finally get to see these Kurosawa films,
Well,
and then they'd go out of business like a year later, and then we'd be back in the desert.
The other thing, again, kind of keep going back to my uncle, because a lot on my mind, and also living in LA, there was a cable channel there, which you may know about, called the Z Channel. And there's actually a documentary about the guy who programmed the Z Channel, Jerry Harvey. Kind of ended up murder-suicide as how he ended his life, but he was very tight with Sam Peckinpah, Monty Hellman. And Z Channel was like a cable, and it was actually like when the cable boxes you had to put in, I think it was called Z because it was the Z button. But anyway, or whatever the story was. But anyway, it was basically like a premium cable channel that showed movies. But I mean, it was like the Criterion Channel would be now, but on in 1979, 1980, and they had their own magazine that was a guide with all that stuff.
That.
And it just, I mean, the things you would see on there. like nobody even has that eclectic taste. Certainly nobody programming a major cable network or whatever. So that was another huge thing in terms of movies. This sort of all these things kind of converging of like KRLA bringing back Wolfman Jack and Real Don Steele and listening to oldies radio almost like in this real-time experience, and then seeing like this, going to like a film festival every week of the most obscure and bizarre and sometimes weird, sort of films and foreign films and stuff that was on there. So yeah, I was pretty lucky just in a cultural way, even though my parents were, not the most voracious consumers of pop culture. My mom was a painter, she's an artist, she was more for like fine arts kind of stuff. But from my uncle and just the environment in LA, I was very lucky, early on to get that stuff. So and then also television, again, sort of dating myself, but in those days too, like my Saturday morning TV viewing or weekend TV viewing was like get up at 6 a.m, watch Little Rascals. You know what I mean?
Get that bowl of cereal.
Get that bowl of cereal, Little Rascals, and then you watch your cartoons, and then they'd be Three Stooges, and then it'd be the Munsters, F Troop, Gilligan's Island on Channel 5 in LA. So it was a really kind of I don't know, weird. I mean, everybody gets some of that with the Brady Bunch and Gilligan's Island stuff, but it was more like, I don't know, I think, and then even Bugs Bunny cartoons, like my sense of cultural knowledge because of those things sort of went way back, whereas I think now kids, they only see things that are 10, 15, 20 years old max, whereas when we were, you and I were kids, or people, this generation were kids, their cultural knowledge went back 70 years because you'd get some of that filtered from cartoons, and some of it filtered from like reruns and Little Rascals and just references and things, just a kind of a knowledge of culture that sort of way extended what your own generation.
Well, my thing is, when I was a kid, I knew about the older stuff.
Exactly.
I knew who the Marx Brothers were. I knew the Three Stooges were. I mean, I watched the Three Stooges every day when I got home from school.
Yeah.
And I love the Three Stooges.
Right.
But there's lots of kids that won't watch anything that are subtitled or black and white.
Yeah, we didn't have
won't do it.
Yeah,
and I had friends that still won't do that.
Right.
And I had a record store in the 80s, and there was all these movies coming out that none of the other stores in town were carrying.
Right.
So we started like a repertory video store out of this record store.
Right.
And we had Eraserhead, and we had just basically we just got everything that nobody else had. We were the only store in town that carried Last Temptation of Christ.
Wow.
The only one in all of Indianapolis that carried it. So we got two, which was unheard of back then because VHS were like $100 a piece.
Yeah, $99.95 or whatever.
When Criterion started putting out all those Ozu and Kurosawa and Mitsuguchi films, we're like going, oh shit, yeah, we got to get those. $100 a piece.
Right.
And then everyone's telling us, they're like, well, you must be making money hand over fist. And I'm like going, dude, we pay $100 for this, and we get it back $250 at a time.
Right.
If it goes out that many times before it breaks.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't, quite so much grow up in record stores, but I did pretty much grow up in video stores in LA. There was Odyssey Video, which was a pretty deep catalog relatively in West LA, because it's kind of they're a little more savvy about film. I mean, I never really got to where Tarantino worked videos or whatever because I was on the other side of town. But and then when I got to Arizona, there was a Casa Video, which was amazing, and they had kind of like you would go there and they had every Peckinpah film, including like the very early ones, or they had all the like Hong Kong John Woo movies before all that was accessible. So that was my other part of my college education was this is jumping ahead, but was kind of having places like that, where you could see that stuff and dig into it. So it was a kind of adventure, I guess, or like it's always that thing. It's for me, it's very rewarding to have YouTube and be able to look up all this stuff I've always wondered about, or I saw once. I mean, I was sitting with my wife a few weeks ago, just kind of in a reminiscing mood on a Saturday. We got on talking about like this carpet place in California that had the most sort of incessant jingle that I still sort of is lodged in my head called Carpeteria, and then that got me on to think of watching all these commercials, like they had like Air Check basically from whatever channel 11 on us, and it was just like Chic Center commercial, like all these things, and it's funny how that weird sort of junk lodges in your brains, but it does, at that age, but it does really brought back a lot of memories.
I got some jingles left over from childhood. I lived in LA for 10 years.
Oh, right.
Yeah, and I gravitated toward the Crazy Gideon commercials.
Right.
Remember those?
Yeah.
If you don't shop at my store, you're an idiot.
I think there was always in LA they had a lot. There was a lot of good commercials, just because the people thought maybe they'll be discovered or something.
Well, you know what freaked me out is when I discovered public access.
Oh yeah.
Public access has porn on it in Los Angeles, and like not just porn, but like domination porn. There was I ran across one, and I actually ended up taping it, of people that did like bondage porn in the closed LA Zoo in the park. They were like going to all the old cages and whipping each other, having sex in the cages. And I'm like going, this is free on public access.
Right.
And I remember the first time I encountered it, I'm watching TV, and it was after watching this lady named Francine Dancer, who was kind of big out there.
Right.
She does these shows where she just basically just dances half naked to like some hippie playing the guitar.
Right.
So something comes on, I'm watching it, it's horribly amateurish, it looks like crap, it's filmed horrible, and then I'm going, I think that guy just got his cock out. And I'm looking, and I'm like, wait a minute, I think he's about, and they're about to, and the next thing I know, they're going at it, and I'm like going,
what channel is it?
This is public access.
What years were you out in LA?
2001 or 2011.
Well, when I was a kid out there was, it wasn't UHF or public access, but it was kind of like a local sort of station. There was this guy named Wally George. I don't know. If
I know Wally, yeah, sure.
I mean, Wally
George.
The
Mentors on.
Yeah, he had Mentors on.
That tape made during the tape trading days, that clip made the round.
So this was, dead set in mid-80s, 84, 85 was kind of his height, and he had a radio show, and he had this TV show, and he was portraying, he had been he was a sort of right-leaning host, but this was a shtick,
right?
And it really was kind of like wrestling, and he had all these Orange County guys who would be in the audience, and they'd be chanting. It was sort of Jerry Springer, all this stuff, and he was like a big Reagan guy, big John Wayne guy. It was like for Orange County
It
people.
wasn't Rebecca De Mornay,
his daughter, right?
Yeah.
And I used to love Wally George because I saw it for what it was theater. My dad was like, this is ridiculous. And now you watch Wally George, and it's like Wally George is the template for all the as a goof is the template for all Fox News and the Bill O'Reillys and all that stuff. Yeah. So it was weird. So that was another kind of influence. In terms of the '80s is kind of is wrestling and the Wally George and the Martin
wrestling
Downeys.
was big out here.
Yeah.
I took Husker Du to my house when they were in town.
Oh, right.
Because they had a couple hours to kill, and they didn't want to hang out at the crappy place they were playing.
Right.
So I took them to my house. We just sat around, and we had some wrestling posters up on the wall, and we had them up as a joke. We weren't really into wrestling.
Right.
We just thought the posters were funny.
Right.
And they were like, oh my God, is that blah, 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 blah.
Well,
we love wrestling. And they were really
into and Bob Mould ended up becoming a writer for WCW.
Did he?
Yeah, he ended up, in between his music career, maybe, 10, 15 years ago, did that actually. It's kind of crazy.
Yeah, because, like I said, because I owned the record store by the venue, and because I was in a band, like the Meat Puppets stayed at our house, and the Minutemen stayed at our house.
This is the days of sleeping on floors and
bands. That's exactly what it was. And we had a big house and a bunch of couches, so we were just like, yeah, come on over. And we had a huge basement. We had a basement that was basically 3 large bedrooms. And we had a recording studio, band practice space in one. We set up a slot racing track in the other one, a really big one. And then the third room, a friend of mine got some chairs that he stole from IBM. And we got some seat belts from a junkyard, and we connected seat belts to the chairs with these bolts so you could strap yourself in, and we cut off these hockey sticks, and we used to play hockey.
Mini hockey.
Yeah, with these 4, and man, it was bloody because we'd be
laughing.
We're like 20, 21.
Man,
we don't care about safety. Yeah. We're like hitting each other with these sticks and knocking each other off these chairs. You played hockey over there, didn't you?
You guys were living the dream, man.
It was, dude. For about 10 years, I lived in houses that were just basically party houses. We had a 4th of July party once where the police got called on us. Not because of noise, but because some of the kids took the drain pipes and broke them off of the front. No, they broke them off our house and were using them to bazooka bottle rockets at the neighbors across the street. That was the kind of parties we ended up having. And the thing was like half the people in the house were underage and tripping. And so the police were like going, everyone has to leave. And everyone's like going, where do I go? So everyone left. And then over the next 2 hours, one by one, they just started drifting back dude, I'm tripping. I can't go anywhere but here. Can I just sit down? We had kegs of beer in the basement. The police never went down there. If they did, it would have been a completely different
story, right?
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, that's funny you say that about MX80 because I've worked on it. Have you seen that site? It's called By NWR.
Oh, yeah.
The reference, right? Yeah. So
yeah,
I'm one of the guest editors or one of the people with Jimmy that kind of helps put it together. So
yeah, what I like about him is, I always feel that I've got a fairly good knowledge of obscure stuff. He always brings up stuff I wouldn't have a clue about.
Right. Yeah.
He's really good at digging up stuff that just nobody knows. You know, he was the one that turned me on to God. What was that husband and wife that used to do films?
Oh yeah.
The Monster and the Stripper was one of them. Yeah,
yeah.
he's the one that turned me on. He gave me my first copy of that.
Oh wow. Jimmy?
Huh?
Oh yeah, I didn't know you knew him like that.
Yeah, he used to make fun of me. Me and him and Dale and somebody else went to a record store once to buy my first bootleg was Elvis Costello at the El Macambo.
All right.
That show that has that guy in the audience who's yelling so loud it ruins the
Right.
entire thing. Whee! That guy.
Yeah.
So I'm there buying that, and Jimmy was kind of he was like, oh really, Elvis Costello, huh? And he was looking for some rare stone stuff.
Right.
He was already serious.
Right.
And I'm sure he didn't mean anything by it.
Right.
But I've always been really intimidated by him, and I haven't seen him since then. I haven't seen him since I was a
He's
teenager.
mellowed with age. He's a good guy. He's just
Right. Yeah, I saw him on the Tales from the tour bus.
Oh, right.
And he looked much different than I remember.
Yeah. He's kind of got the pompadour. He's got.
But I'm gonna catch up with him someday.
Yeah, you should.
Because,
If you're ever up northwest, he's up outside of Portland, but.
Yeah. So, all right. So, let's start with the book. What was it that made you say, "Hey, I'm going to write this book"?
Well, I would always been a fan of the Replacements, even sort of going back to this kind of childhood. Caught up with them. There was always one of my favorite bands. I did manage to see them twice before they broke up. I saw them in '89 opening for Petty in Phoenix, and then on that last tour again in Phoenix. I was in high school, so I never saw the Bob lineup, but I saw them a couple of times before they went out, and then just kind of as I got into writing about music professionally, my paths would cross with them. Westerberg was still putting out records, Tommy was putting out records, and then through that I also kind of got to know some of the people that were involved with their career, including Peter Jesperson, who was their first manager and co-founder of Twin Tone Records. And then in 2004, I did a story in person with Westerberg for the late lamented Harp magazine, where I went to Minneapolis. It was on that Folker record. He wasn't doing a whole lot of press. I think he only did a couple of magazine interviews, and this was one of them. Mm-hmm. So we met, and his father had recently passed, I think, if I'm remembering, a few months earlier. And so he was kind of talking about that. He was maybe in a more open and reflective mood than would have been typical for him. And we sort of hit it off. I kind of filed that away for a couple years in the transition from moving from Chicago to Memphis. I had actually thought about trying to do another book first, a biography of Curtis Mayfield, and actually met with his family.
One of my huge favorites.
Yeah, and there is a book that came out by one of his other sons, but I don't think. He's really is a giant, and in terms of his publishing and how he had his record company set up, really a pioneer too, and just had a really interesting kind of story. But I couldn't quite get that together, and it was probably a good thing. It would have been beyond me at that point. So I thought, well, always kind of wanted to do a book, or thought I should, and I spent a couple years kind of approaching the project. First, I knew that really my gut sense was, even though they had been written a lot about during their career, obviously, and that there had been a couple of things written. There was a chapter in Our Band Could Be Your Life, although it really only covered the early years. I thought, there's a lot that has been written about this band, but it still feels like there's something more to this story that hasn't been told. It's like, nothing really explained the behavior, nothing really explained the expectations that they exceeded and the ones they didn't meet. There was a kind of hole in the middle of it, that there was a lot of interesting anecdotal stuff about them, but I just felt like there was something there. I didn't know what that was at the time, so I thought, I really want to do this. I really only want to do it with their involvement, because I think that's the only way to make it meaningful. So I spent about a year and a half kind of talking and pitching Westerberg and Stinson on the idea, a lot of that through Jesperson in terms of Stinson, and a lot of that through Paul's manager Darren Hill. And in that interim, they asked me to write liner notes for the reissue of Tim, which was actually in 2005-06, but it didn't come out till 2008. And then I, somewhere around 2007, I went and saw Westerberg, he hadn't performed for a couple years. He did this on-stage interview with Warren Zevons at Del Fuegos in Minneapolis. And so I went to go see that, and in the interview, Warren actually quoted my interview at Harp and said, "This is the best interview anybody's ever done with you," da-da-da. And I didn't know him at that point. I've since come to know Warren, and so it was a genuine thing. He wasn't trying to compliment. I thought, man, I really got to try and, I can do this with this guy. But obviously they were very reticent kind of subjects. And then at the same time, I met with Tommy for the first time, and at dinner at Peter Jesperson's house with the idea of pitching him on the book. And his answer, which is usually a way to get out of things, is, "Well, I'll do it if Paul will," thinking and knowing in most cases Paul won't.
Yeah, that's like your mom saying, "I'll say yes if your dad says
yeah,
yes,"
right.
And you know it's a no at that point.
Right, pretty much. So that was the start of the relationship, and then a few months later, I actually very thankfully got and I kind of submitted a formal pitch to Darren, Paul's manager, saying, "Here's how I would do a book, here's what I'm thinking," which did not entirely resemble the finished product, but at least it was like, let's do something meaningful.
Right.
And there had been a book in that interim, Jim Walsh, who did a kind of oral history, and so I think they were a little more open. Enough time had passed. A lot of the band's resistance or reluctance to kind of talk about the Replacements era is because both Paul and Tommy, and even Chris and Slim at that point, were pursuing their own careers. They didn't want to sort of be moored in the past. And I think crucially not enough time had passed since Bob had died, So there was always a kind of, but by 2007, 2008, the band had been broken up 15, 18 years. Bob had been, passed away a decade or more. So there was some thought of like, maybe there's enough time to assess this legacy. And so I went out, Spin gave me an assignment to write about the first 4 reissues of that reissue campaign of the Replacements reissue. So I went to Minneapolis a second time to meet with Paul, and we did this interview ostensibly for the magazine piece. And they said, "Well, let's talk about the book." Like I said, he'd already seen my pitch. So I turned the recorder off, and we talked about how I would do it and all that stuff. And that interview, I came to realize, was kind of the first interview for the book anyway. But he didn't, we were still talking in theoretical terms. So then I came back a week or so later, and his manager called and said, "Yeah, he'll do the book." So I thought, well, this is great. It took me another year, and of course that was right around beginning of 2008, and then fall of 2008. The economy crashed, so the publishing industry changed. I had an agent. I was trying to pitch it, work up my proposal. They also had some business amongst the band to kind of solve in that interim. So it took another year before I really got going in earnest in 2009. And so really from the outset, it was like, here's a band that is cool, that I like, that I could probably live with doing the research for a long time. It's not a subject that's been totally picked over, even though they've been written about a lot. I don't think they've been written about. The real story hasn't been told. And I feel like there's something compelling there. There's something at the heart of this that nobody knows, really understands. And so maybe, in addition to all the stuff that they're exciting, they have great stories, all the wild drunken antics would make for good entertainment. I knew that it could have both flash and substance, so that was really it. Of course, I didn't realize, I thought, and when I sold the book in 2009, I thought it would be a 2-year process, a year to research, a year to write. As it turned out, I didn't come out till 2016, so it was more like a 7-year process. 9 if you really count the year and a half, 2 years I spent kind of working on it, and I'm still in the midst of it. Still, we're doing reissues, and the paperback came out, the audiobook, and now I've done a couple reissues. So it's.
Did you read the audiobook?
I didn't know. Actually, Paul's sister, who's a DJ, she's the kind of the voice of public radio, NPR in Minneapolis. She did it. So,
that's cool.
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting. It's such a male story. I thought it'd be interesting to have it, and also she can do imitations of everyone. And
that's always handy.
Yeah,
that's always handy.
So yeah, I don't know. It was mainly because I was a fan, but I thought there's a great story there on the surface, and I had a sense that maybe there was an even more compelling story, under the surface there.
Well, you were right, because I'm reading it now, but I'm reading it for the second time.
Right.
I was hoping to have finished it again, but before I got here, but only got about halfway. I read it when it first came out about 2 years ago.
Yeah, 3 years ago. Yeah.
So, but I don't want to blow smoke up your ass.
Blow away, smoke away.
But it's honestly one of my very favorite music books at this point. I mean, it's never going to surpass Mystery Train, which I've read like maybe 20 times. But I was amazed well, first I was amazed that you got Paul to agree to it, because like I said, I never had any problems with him or anything, but he always just seemed like someone who just didn't want to talk.
Right.
And that wasn't just my experience. That was like that was his reputation.
Right.
So when when you first mentioned the book, however you contacted me,
right.
I remember thinking, man, there's no way he's going to get published.
Right.
There's no way. but you did.
Right.
And I think that you couldn't have done the book without it.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it opened up, and it was weird. I kind of, in doing the research, Paul is not I don't want to say maintaining relationships. He's a hermetic kind of guy, or has become, and I kind of almost became his emissary to his past. Looking up all these guys in high school he played with, or he'd never talked to in 30 years. His friend who from high school had committed suicide. I talked to his family. I got him a photo of him. It's like what I'm saying is he didn't also, not only did he talk to me, he didn't stand in the way of me talking to all kinds of people.
Right.
So that was really good and important, I think, in terms of rounding out the story. And then I was very lucky to have the whole Stinson family, particularly his mom Anita and his older sister Lonnie, were really crucial to kind of unpack and understand the Bob side of the story and the Stinson side of the story. And then really from the label side, they were very lucky in that, as the thing about the replacements, maybe drinking a lot, or also none of them having driver's licenses, that they couldn't get to the gig.
That was so funny.
That somebody had to be more sober and more responsible for them. And for them, it was first half of their career was Peter Jesperson, and the second half it was Michael Hill, their A&R man at Warner Brothers. So I had two kind of like foundational kind of people who were deeply involved in their career in many ways, and also their later management at High Noon, Russ and Gary, Russ Rieger and Gary Habib. So there was always people around who could shed insight, and because like I say, the Replacements were as a band were very. They weren't self-determining, say, in the way REM were. They would sort of create chaos and see how people reacted, and that is how things would go. And so if that's the case, then you're going to get a lot of your information from the people who are reacting to the chaos, whether it's managers, friends, family, all that stuff. So that's why, I ended up doing 300 some interviews, even if I didn't use all of them, because it was the only way to really understand a band that didn't spend a lot of time in their career trying to understand themselves or their power or their problems or anything like that.
Right. Now I'm assuming this book is pretty time consuming. You were able to keep your job going here.
Well, that's why it took so long. Is I was working a regular full-time job and doing magazine stuff for Mojo, and also researching for a long time. And I was probably researching a solid 2 years before I even wrote the first put the first word down. So, of course they say researching is a good way to procrastinate and avoid actually writing the thing.
Right.
So there was some of that. But yeah, so I mean, and I did all the first time author mistakes. I let all my audio pile up so that and I transcribed everything myself because it was just too much. I couldn't afford to, have somebody transcribe 300 interviews and however many thousands of hours. So there was just logistical things like that, and also I kind of knew in terms of, particularly with the family stuff, with the Stinson family, I couldn't get everything I needed in one interview. That it was going to have to take time and me going back a couple times and staying in contact until they really trusted me and opened up and been willing to sort of examine their lives and Bob's life and everyone. You know what I mean? So that was. It may have driven my editor and my publisher crazy a bit, but the sort of gestation period was absolutely, in hindsight, was absolutely crucial to having the finished product be as whatever as it is. I couldn't have done that if I'd have delivered it on time or even 2 years late. It had to sort of, and my feeling was, I'm this far along. There's only going to be one shot really to do this book the way I'm doing it, I mean, maybe they'll become so popular that Mark Lewison will write a 3-volume. But you know what I mean. I figured
you're still stuck on the second volume.
But I just figured I'm going to go all in. Right. This is my shot. This is the thing I care about. And as I got deeper into that, was the weird thing. I when I was kind of canvassing other authors or people for advice and talking about writing a book, I talked to somebody I didn't really know, David Ritz, who's mostly known for doing collaborative books.
Marvin Gaye books.
Yeah, all that stuff.
Yeah.
And I was just asking him, for kind of general author advice. And the thing he told me that stuck with me, I remember this was when I was still in Chicago. He said, well, whatever you write about, whatever subject you choose, make sure you're really, really, really interested in it, and you're going to be interested in it all the way through, because there's nothing worse than reading a book where you can tell the author loses interest halfway through or 2/3 of the way through. And as I was doing the research, as a fan, And I think it's a pretty it's not a fan book. I mean, I have the enthusiasm and the knowledge and the passion for the subject, but I'm pretty, even-handed, I think. It's not a sort of whatever. But I think because I'm a fan, I would be doing this research and learning things that probably nobody really knew or very few people knew.
Right.
And I'd be like, man, if this is impressing me this much, it's certainly going to impress other fans and hopefully other readers. So as I kept getting deeper into it, I was like, I have to stay with this and follow this thread kind of wherever it goes and however long it takes. And so, as it happened, some of the gestation was by virtue of while I was finishing it or in the home stretch, they did a reunion in 2013. They reunited. So then it was like, well, we need to kind of wait to see how this plays out. It's going to be, in terms of timing. I mean, so I was maybe 2/3 of the way done when they announced the reunion, and then took another year, and then there was an epilogue. And so I kind of had to wait to see how that played out. So, I always say, the book took me 10 years, and it did. Really took 7 from the signing the deal to publishing it, and it was really 6 and change of actual work, but spread out in a pretty light way so that, I could live and work and do other stuff. But again, all of that fortunately fed into I think the quality of the book and the depth of it, was by virtue of the fact that I sort of labored on it for so long.
Right. Well, one of the impressions I got from it, and one of the impressions that I'm most thankful to have gotten from it, is before reading this book, if you would have said the words Bob Stinson to me, I would have said, big drunken oaf.
Right.
Right. And after reading the book and reading the backstory, I was like, Jesus Christ, this poor guy.
Yeah. Well, the thing.
Obviously, he was a product of his. Very much a product of his upbringing. Yeah,
and when I found out kind of the depth and scope of Bob and what his life had been, his early life had been, in a way I knew that was the key, or one of the keys to unlocking the story. That I had always, and maybe that was my instinct going in, was I always felt like the portrayal of Bob on the good side, like this wild man guitar player, on the bad side, as you say, the sort of drunken oaf. It had to be more there. There was, and I extended that to the band too. It was like, there were reasons why they did what they did. There were reasons why they didn't become bigger. There were reasons why they're also so great. There were reasons why those songs were so great and their chemistry was so great. And it wasn't just happenstance. There were these kind of formative forces at work and societal and familial and environmental or whatever that kind of conspired to make the Replacements as magic as they were. And so it was finding that stuff out. And yes, the part of the goal was to create a fully fleshed 3-dimensional portrait of Bob Stinson so people could understand him. Once I found out that stuff from his family.
You very much did that.
Yeah. So that was kind of, it, but that also is what sort of drives the story. If Bob doesn't have that childhood, if he doesn't go away to sort of the juvenile detention sort of system, if he doesn't come back and see Tommy kind of go on that same road and doesn't grab him and put a bass in his hands, if they don't sort of create this thing that has power but no direction, and Westerberg with his own problems and his own sort of like familial stuff and his own kind of mental stuff doesn't come and link, and they don't recognize that in each other on some level, the Replacements doesn't happen, or they're just another band. I think the reason people are still talking about them and they're still vibrant and fresh and all that sort of stuff is there is something really kind of profound in their experience and them as people that's really relatable and human, and that's kind of the story I wanted to tell. So.
Yeah. And every generation there's going to be a small group of people like us who are intensely interested in one subject who are going to discover them.
Right.
I mean, it's like I discovered Big Star after the fact.
Right.
And I discovered various bands after the fact because I wasn't there. Yeah. And I assume kids are still doing the same thing.
Yeah, they are. And I just think and in the writing of it for me it was. This isn't, because you get a lot of, I think probably of in the kind of music book world, probably the more disappointing things. You get a lot of great books about single artists. I think band bios tend to sometimes not be as good, or there aren't as many great ones.
Right.
And I think some of that is because there's competing agendas. You don't always get everybody. There's, you know what I mean? There's
always a holdout.
Yeah, there's always a holdout. And in a sense, Chris Mars was a holdout on this, but I was able to kind of fill that in to a certain extent. And there's just a complexity to band bios that it's much harder to sort of to do them, I think.
You have to work around the band politics.
Yeah, the geometry, the calculus of a band bio is much different than when you're dealing with a single artist, I think. Right. And so that was a challenge too. And so that all kind of fed into that. But the reward is then if you write a decent one, I think people recognize it. And also, my idea was from the beginning, it's like, I don't want to do just another band book. I want to do a story about a group of people, artists, kids, who grew up in this whatever 10-12 year period mostly, and the lives preceding and a little bit of the lives after, and sort of try and understand what that experience was and why what they created in that time sort of still resonates. And so the only way to do that was to go all the way back to the beginning and really get into the sort of some darker corners of their personal lives, because with a lot of bands, a lot of artist biographies, the first part of the story isn't that interesting, or it isn't as essential to what the art is and what it becomes. I mean, everybody is a product of their childhood to a certain extent, but in some cases it's just not as impactful. But there is a direct line with the Replacements, with Bob, with Tommy, with Paul, with Chris, into what they became, why they found each other, why they sounded the way they did, why they were as good as they were, why they got as high as they did, why they couldn't get any higher, all that. It's as Paul says in the beginning, he said that, they all had these family backgrounds, and he said, we recognize something in each other that we didn't recognize in anybody else, and that's what the story is, really. And so it was kind of, I had to do that. And I think, without belaboring the childhood stuff or the family background stuff, I think that was what I was proudest of in a kind of technical sense, is just getting the right amount of that.
Usually that's boring.
Usually that is boring. Right. And like I say, it's the thread, even like the sort of simple things in Westerberg's childhood, his relationship with his father, and his father talking about business, or it would shape his understanding of the music business, down. Right. So everything are these like sort of delicate threads that go all the way through the story. And so then the childhood stuff becomes very important. The formative years become very important. And that's just as a start. And then of course you get into the sort of life of the band, and it's its own kind of crazy adventure.
Yeah, I have a friend of mine who won't read that Mark Lewison book. He says, I'm waiting for the second one. That early stuff is never interesting.
Right.
And I'm like going, no.
Right.
No, I mean, this has got like the Hamburg stuff in it and stuff like this is what you want.
I think if you're a fan of the band, I mean, my hope and my goal, and I think it's been realized to a certain extent, is that there are people who are either casual fans or not that big of fans of the band who can read this book and sort of enjoy it, even though it's pretty deep. But it's like, because you're just, it's a human story, you know what I mean? It's a tragedy or a comedy or a tragicomedy, you know what I mean? And so it relates on that level. But if you're a fan of the band, and that's always been my thing, is like, I've had some reactions like, oh, I don't want to know this, or I don't want to read that book because I'm afraid of what I'll find out. And I was like, that may be so, and there's some people that maybe like the band less, but I think the stronger feeling, or the thing I'm happiest with, when people come away reading the book and knowing the stories behind everything, feeling like they love the band even more, or appreciate the band even more, or more marvel even more, as I do, that they lasted as long as they did. They made 8 albums, they have this impact, and that, when they did reunite in whatever, a few years ago, that, there's 15,000 people, sort of screaming these songs back to them.
Oh, yeah.
As, so I think it's like, this is the story of kind of the short-term failure, but the long-term success, And
once you've made the albums, they're out there to discover.
Right.
And if you wait 15 years to come back, lots of people have discovered you by then.
And it's funny, when I remember, I never regarded the Replacements as failures. I mean, there's this whole mythos that people in America, particularly, Big Star being the perfect example, the beautiful losers of the band that didn't quite make it, and we all love the romance of that, and it's true to an extent with the Replacements. I mean, they made 4 major label out. They weren't Big Star or even any name your cult band. I mean, they were relatively high profile. They were people, not even that they aspired, other people aspired for them to be the next big American rock band, the next Rolling Stones, the next Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, or whatever. And obviously they were not going to be that in their own time, but since, and I think the book hopefully sort of extends that and is a kind of marker, so that people can, in addition to having the albums, in addition to having the music or whatever, they can sort of have the story as well, and hopefully that enhances their reputation. So.
Now, you said you didn't talk to Chris very much, or?
Initially, Chris is a very successful visual artist, super successful, and that's kind of, as Paul jokes in the book, he says, Chris puts the band on a level with his paper route as a kid. It's like, yeah, I had a paper route as a kid, then I was in this band, then I became the artist that I always wanted to be. So Chris hasn't really, other than, a little bit in Our Band Could Be Your Life 20 years ago, really talked about the Replacements experience. I did talk to him, I did meet with him, I did interviews with him in his home. Some of that stuff is in the book. But long term, I didn't have quite the access that I did with Paul and Tommy, which was, pretty much constant and deep all the way through. But I was very fortunate. Some people who had done long interviews with him gave them to me. So I think, and in a way, the fact that Chris wasn't as involved almost forced me more to focus on his story and do the research and do the work. And so I think he's as fully fleshed out as any of them. And to the extent that he's not as big a character all through is because his role in the band did sort of diminish to a certain extent. He became a little marginalized. He removed himself from it, leading to his departure before the band was done. So I think to that extent, I think all the sort of characterizations of the guys in the band is true to kind of the experience and what their roles were. Bob, I think, is the exception. I sort of follow him even when he's out of the band, because I think the spirit of the band and that story, and even the juxtaposition of their stories as Bob is out of the band, the Replacements are kind of reaching this commercial peak. Are they going to make it? Aren't they? And Bob is kind of starting over. So there was a kind of, that juxtaposition was also important to understanding the larger story. And at the end of the day, I say this is a story of families. There's in brotherhoods. It's the brotherhood of the band. It's the brotherhood between Paul and Tommy that became the brotherhood. It's the real blood brotherhood of Bob and Tommy. And then it's how those brotherhoods, evolve and fracture, and how families too, that you can be sort of shattered by your own family, and you find this other family that maybe is functional for a while, but eventually the dysfunction catches up. Right. I think it did for Bob, it did for Paul, it has in various ways, and you either deal with it or you're consumed by it. And in Bob's case, to a certain extent, he was consumed by it. The others kind of survived it.
Have they contacted you since the book's been published?
Oh yeah, I because kind of by virtue of doing the book, I kind of have become partially a de facto archivist for the band, because I did so much research and nobody had really sort of done that work. So have become involved in kind of their catalog. I produced the live record, Live at Maxwell's, 1986 document of them playing in Hoboken that came out. We just co-produced this box set on their Don't Tell a Soul era of unreleased versions of stuff from the record and a live record. So I've been in pretty regular contact with Tommy, with Paul, to a certain extent with his management. I haven't heard directly back from Chris, although I've heard secondhand good things.
So they're all happy with the book?
Yeah, I don't think happy is not a typical state for Westerberg, but
not unhappy.
Well, the story is when I was finishing the book and the galleys were out, I had wanted Paul to give a blurb, even if it was a sort of smart-ass throwaway kind of blurb, and he was willing to do that. And then he said,
in my mind, I can picture him saying, "Who the hell would want to read this shit?"
Right? Yeah.
Paul Westerberg.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
That's what I thought it would be. And then as we were getting to the point, he said, "Well, no, I should actually read it." So I was like, "Okay." Yeah. And I FedExed him a copy of the Galley. This would have probably been on like a Friday, or he got it on a Friday. And Saturday night, the following night, about 3 a.m, I get a call, unknown caller, which I know which unknown caller that is, and I was like, we'll see what this is. And he left a message, and he was, I think, overwhelmed, in a certain extent, grousing about some things, but just, listen, if somebody FedExed me a copy of a 500-page book that basically was a kind of forensic sort of analysis of my 20s, I might be a little put off too, or a little thrown by that.
Yeah.
So I was really panicked, because I thought, oh man, this is going to go south right before publication. It's going to be like a Jimmy McDonough, Neil Young situation. God knows what.
I heard a lot of backstory about that. Yeah.
So then I was like, had a pretty restless, and then I called him back immediately, didn't answer. So I'm like, fuck. So I had a pretty sleepless night, and next morning, and then I remember I was actually, just to kind of burn off some adrenaline, I was at the gym playing basketball, and then he called me back. So then as I'm in my gym shorts outside the gym, we talked for about 2 hours. He had read the book twice, I think, at that point. As he put it, he said, I read it once, front to back, and then I read it backwards, so I knew it would have a happy ending at least. And we talked. And it's funny, the things you would think he would care about, he didn't care about. He was asking a lot about, was like, well, you bring up the fact that we're Catholic a lot. You bring, or what, just minor things. Right. There were some minor corrections. He's like, it wasn't this sister who hit me with the baseball bat accidentally. It was another, there's stuff like that. And then he was asking some bigger picture stuff, and he said, I wish there was more about how we played our guitars or something like that. And I was like, well, there's plenty of that in there, And then we talked, and we just kind of talked through it. And I said, well, this is why I did this, this is why I did that. And I think, I was batting even with him, at least in that conversation in the high 90s, of like, okay, but it's funny, the things that he was probably bugged about that he thought would be nobody ever brought up or noted. It's a weird, you get weird rabbit ears, and everybody has their own perception. Sure. But
what's minor to one person is maybe right. to another.
And but then he also said some very complimentary things like, this part was really crazy to read all this stuff. I didn't know this, the part made me very emotional, blah, blah, blah. I was crying. So it's like I took that as a good thing. And so there wasn't, I knew I had sort of almost wrestled on the ground. And then he just sort of said, and we'd talk at that point like for an hour and a half or something, 2 hours, just on the phone, maybe not quite that long, but about there. And he said, I got to go make dinner. It's all good. And that was it. So there was a moment where I was like, this 6 years of work could go very soon. And then I think the reaction, which was incredibly positive, and became a New York Times bestseller, surprisingly somehow.
Yes, you are the first New York Times bestselling author I've ever talked to.
And good reviews and the response, and it just we did an event in Minneapolis that sold out the Turf Club. We sold out of books. It's just I think it to whatever extent it validated his belief or his willingness to participate in the whole band's, in that people were like, this is a really good book. This is a serious book about you, and it elevates the band in a way. And I think he probably won't admit to it, but Paul or anybody else would be. You can't help but at least feel like, okay, well, there's a book that's worthy of us. Exactly. And the response sort of validates that. In Tommy's case, Tommy, because of the family stuff, I let Westbrook see the galley, and he corrected, but I didn't really change anything in terms of substantive stuff. A couple niggling things that he mentioned, and I considered, and I thought it was a fair. With Tommy, he only wanted to initially look over the first few chapters, having to deal more with the family stuff. Right. And I told his sister particularly that I would let her see a kind of preview of that. So because I want to make sure I got it right, because there's obviously very sensitive stuff about abuse and their family history and things like that. And I think I don't know if Tommy ever. I see Tommy. I was just in LA with Tommy and doing stuff with him for the box set and things like that, and we're I would say fairly close still. And but Tommy has a weird relationship with stuff. He openly admits, he's like, I can't read that. He has it's hard for him.
Sure.
And A, he lived it. B, he had to relive it with me in all the interviews. So he doesn't really need to read it. But to the extent that, he gives his okay, he's, and his family and his ex-wife, who he's still very close to, she was kind of read it. So I got all the, the feedback I need, I think, from the band to know, and from everybody else and all the managers and all that stuff. So the fact that I've been involved and continue to be involved on some level in their in maintaining or helping maintain their legacy as far as releases and various projects, I think it's a good sign. We'll see if that lasts, but I think do Paul and I hang out the way we would occasionally when I was doing it? No, but he's also, in a way, he's only done one other interview, and it was for right around before the book came out. Actually, he did a thing for Spin, a great piece that they did around the time he released that record with Juliana Hatfield, and he didn't talk about the replacements at all in that. So part of the thing he feels like is this is his statement anyway. Now, he could write his own book, maybe down the road he will. I hope he does. I don't know that that'll happen, but I think he's shed himself of whatever he needed to analyze and express about the replacements and that experience. And so, so I kind of got the last of him, I think, on this. I would love it if he does some interviews to promote the box set, but that may not happen. So
now, while you were working on the book, I assume you had nights where you had to make phone calls, like, hey, I'm at this part here. Was this true? Did this really happen? Did you have to
with Paul?
With
him? Yeah, I mean, obviously there were people I would go back to regularly, like Peter Jesperson. I probably talked to him 150 times, you know, and going back, checking little things, and not just formal interviews. Same with Michael Hill, same with various other folks. You know, the way I tended to work with the principals, with the band, was I would, you know, we did a couple big sort of initial interviews, sets of interviews. I would either go up to Minneapolis or wherever Tommy was living. Tommy came here in one instance, and then I would go do other research, talk to other people, and then come back and do another set of interviews or another interview, and then do that. I mean, that went on for a period of years. Tommy was actually in Guns N' Roses at the time, so he was touring a lot. So it was almost harder to pin Tommy down than it was Paul, because Paul was just sitting at home. But yeah, that was the way it went, which was really good too, because as I learned more from other people, I could go back and say, you know, sometimes you get an interview at the beginning and that's it, or sometimes you get an interview at the beginning and the end. With me, I could kind of go back as I was developing the research and my understanding of the story. And, you know, a lot of the stuff the band didn't even know. As I say, they were less, you know, there's some bands that know every single thing about their career and total control of it, and there's nothing that was outside, and nothing happened without them knowing about the Replacements because they didn't know or didn't care. You know, there was a lot more people to pull in and who were necessary to pull in, because what they did also had an impact or how they reacted. So, you know, this is from talking to their lawyer, to their A&R guys, to their managers, to all the studio guys, to the guys on the road with them. I mean, you know, there was almost nobody I didn't talk to, and some people, you know, and then me kind of just going back to the early stuff. I mean, the fun things for me were to talk to, like, the guys Paul played with in high school or right before the Replacements, or the guy. I found out, you know, he passed a few years ago, and his wife got a hold of me. The guy who used to run the sober teen center where they played their first gig, and he didn't specifically remember the Replacements as a name. They were called the whatever Impediments, but he's the one who said, you'll never, you know, they were drinking in between their sets, and they threw him out and said, you'll never work in this town again. Hence they changed their name from the Impediments to the Replacements. I mean, I can't even tell you, because I don't even exactly remember, but the threads of finding that guy is a little bit like a, you know, it's a little like a whodunit kind of thing, or this weird chase. And the fact that I found him, I mean, that means almost nothing to probably most people. I mean, it's a cool little nugget. The book probably wouldn't have been substantially different without it, but I mean, that's like one of my proudest achievements in my life is that I found.
That was one of the great sequences. Well, we worked on a documentary about the legendary Stardust Cowboy.
Oh, right.
And it went on for like almost 8 or 9 years.
Right.
And I guess what I was getting at is, like, you know, every once in a while I would have to get back in touch with someone and go, hey, what about blah, 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 blah. And I was just wondering if over the years, as you were recontacting people over and over again, did you ever get the feeling like every once in a while somebody would go like, isn't he done with this?
Yeah. Is this actually going to come out?
Or the person you're talking to, maybe you got afraid, maybe they're starting to lose interest and they're not going to cooperate.
Totally, yeah. I mean, there was always the possibility that I could say, all right, I need to do another interview with Paul, and Paul says no more. You know, I mean, it didn't quite get to that point. You know, fortunately, I would have, of course, liked more time or whatever. But pretty much, it's funny. We cut it short one day, and we were supposed to get back the next day, and we didn't. And that's one of the things that he was a little bit like, well, you could have done. And I was like, well, that was what I was going to ask you the day you decided. You know what I mean? But so you can always, but you could all go for forever doing that stuff. In talking to other people, I mean, Michael Hill used to joke after year 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 into 7, he said, "Is this actually ever going to come out?" I was starting to wonder, you know. So I feel very, validated that it actually came out and did okay, because I'm sure people were starting to wonder. But the people, you know, I mean, Peter had great faith. Michael really did have great faith in me and kind of riding with it. So no, you know, and as I say, the time. The extended time working on the book was actually had a lot of value in cultivating relationships with Tommy's family in particular, and you know, a lot of these people I'm very close with now. You know, Slim Dunlap and his wife.
How's he doing?
He's hanging in there. You know, it's a tough road, and but he's very fortunate in that his wife and family and kids and grandkids are all around him, and so he's living. He's totally there mentally, and still sharp as a tack. It's just, you know, physically he's you know, but yeah, so it's like, it's pretty remarkable. You know, at this point I've been working on replacement stuff pretty intensely for 12 years, and you know, I'm only 44, you know, so it's a big chunk of my life. And you know, the Replacements as a band, as guys, I think Paul and Tommy took a long time for them to accept, and I think they probably have at this point. I mean, maybe Tommy was the sort of holdout much longer because he's younger and whatever. I mean, they would say, I hope the Replacements isn't the thing I'm most remembered for. I hope there's something more. But the truth is, the Replacements has continued to grow, and so I think it is their legacy, whether they like it or not. So best to sort of tend to it and respect it. And I think that's and think about it, which is what they did in the process of doing the book, and they have been willing to do in allowing us to do these archival projects. Is like fans are going to be there, they're going to want and be interested, so why not serve them and serve your legacy at the same time? Because I think it's an important and valuable thing. You did good work, and more people should know about it and know the story.
Were there any no-shows, people you wanted to talk to who just...
The only person, because he ended up doing his own book, was Bill Sullivan, who was their roadie for a good chunk, although not as much as maybe as some people think. And we talked, and I met him, and we hung out, and Bill's the kind of cagey guy, and his own book is very good. It's kind of more anecdotal stories and stuff like that. So I would have liked to have had him, but Bill's the kind of guy, what I was looking for in terms of a kind of analysis probably wasn't something he would want to bring or would be able to. So Bill was really the only one. I would have liked more time with Chris and more involvement, but it actually worked out in the end, I think. Bill was the only one. No, everybody else who was alive, basically. I mean, I talked to from Lenny Warnaker to Seymour Stein to every producer. I mean, Jim Dickinson was a friend of mine. We had started to do formal interviews, and he literally passed just as we were going to do he had done some really big, long interviews about the Replacements that hadn't been published that I got and I could add. And then all the engineers, Joe Hardy, John Hampton, who both since passed, I got to spend time with them. So I was very lucky that I got everybody. I talked to Benmont Tench. I asked to talk to Tom Petty. Tom did not. I talked to him later after the fact.
He wasn't a talker.
But Benmont was really the one that was closest to the band, so I got him. In the midst of it, I interviewed Keith Richards, not for the book, but for something else, and I asked him a little bit, and it wasn't anything substantive. But I found a really cool video that he was asked about them, but I didn't see it until after the book came out because it didn't pop up. But from like '88 when they opened for him. So no, I was kind of in a crazy way, because I had sanction sort of from Paul and the band. Mm-hmm. All the doors were sort of open. So it was pretty crazy in that, and I, sadly, a lot of people I've interviewed have since passed. From local Minneapolis people that Paul knew way back when, or Tommy knew way back when, to some of the people, engineers and producers and things like that. So everything kind of worked out at the right time.
Well, we ran into some of that stuff. Like when we were doing the legendary Stardust Cowboy thing, no member of his family would talk to us.
Right.
None. And I wrote like a really nice, flowery letter saying, I don't think you understand that your son is regarded very highly in some circles. He's not,
it's not
a
exploitative,
joke.
right?
I said, I'm not making fun of him. I have no interest in because that was the thing. When we first started, we got a lot of people going, I'm not going to participate in something that's going to make fun of him. And I'm like, that's not what we're doing here. And so his parents, his mom and his sister just would have nothing to do with this. So we had a really hard time getting like baby pictures and early pictures and stuff like that. But on the other hand, at 12 o'clock at night, I'm sitting at my desk and I get a phone call. And I'm like, hello? He says, hi, this is T-Bone Burnett.
Oh, wow.
He's like, how are you going to do that documentary without me? And I was like, okay. I had no idea how to get a hold of him. There was no internet back then.
Well, I had the best kind of arrangement. My friend, as I mentioned, Warren Zanes, who wrote the Tom Petty book, which is excellent. He had the best. He and I both, as it turned out, we sort of had the same arrangement where we had full cooperation, but not authorization, which means that they didn't get to overrule anything, so it's like you have the band, you have all the participation you want, but the band doesn't get to control it. And so I think that's the best of both worlds, is in that you have all the information, all the people involved, and all their family, and the sort of access, but you don't have the pressure of changing things to sort of bend to the band's will. Because I think most authorized biographies, I'm sure there's some good ones, but you can never really, and I think Warren's is the exception, and hopefully mine is too, in that there's involvement, but it's not, doesn't sugarcoat things. It doesn't,
Right.
Between us. Warren's book is great, and he's a really good writer, much better writer than me. So he had like those insights and all that stuff. But the Replacement story is, I don't know. I think there's a lot of skin in the game for those guys, because most bios, music bios, almost all. There's the nobody ever heard of these guys. They're cult artists, whether it's about Rocky Erickson or whoever. But most music bios, particularly band ones, worst case scenario is they become millionaires, they become drug addicts, then they get off drugs and like whatever. At the end of it, it's like a happy thing.
I've seen VH1.
Yeah.
I know what they do.
Whereas with the Replacements, they never really were successful in that sense. There was never any comfort, any leisure in that. And so, like, there's more at stake if this is your life, you know, and there's more consequences. And I think in the Replacement story is like not everybody can relate to being a millionaire rock star, but everybody can relate to being a band in a van scrapping through the Midwest and whatever. I've had so many people in bands who either got to the Replacements level or just short of it or never even got a record deal but were touring. They read the dynamics and read this book and the experiences, and it resonates with them.
It brought back so many memories for me because I kept running across people that I'd met or I played with or whatever. I'm like, oh yeah, that is that dude.
But even like if you're a 30-year-old, my wife was in a band for many years, and she read it, and I think there's just something about life in a band that I think I capture, even though this is an extreme case of it, that a lot of people can relate to, musicians certainly. So a lot of musicians have been very nice about kind of the book and how it kind of connects with them, or they connect with it. So.
Yeah. Any other books in the pipeline?
I have no, not at the moment.
Have you had offers?
I've had offers to do kind of like ghostwrite things or collaborative things, nothing super interesting or enough. And the thing about a book is you spend all these years writing it, and then you gotta tour and promote it and hustle it for a year, and then you got to do the paperback and the audiobook, and then in my case it's been a good thing I've done these kind of related recording projects or reissue projects among the other things I do regularly as far as work and writing. So I haven't had quite the time. Also, my life has been kind of crazy the last couple of years just in terms of losses and things like that. So it's sort of every time I think I'm going to get to the next book, and I've poked around at a couple things that would have been really ideal for one reason or another. It didn't work out, or I decided it wasn't worth doing. So I'm still waiting on the next book, trying to figure out what that is, and I'm starting to get a little itchy now. Although, like I say, I've been occupied. The good thing and the bad thing with Trouble Boys is I'm never going to have. I hope I will, but it's very unlikely I'll have a subject that I have as much personal attachment. That the story will be kind of perfect in the way that it has cool credibility, interesting creative people, interesting personalities. It hasn't been picked over or written about 50 times. It's just underground enough to, like I say, to be cool, but just commercial enough to actually be able to sell some books. You know what I mean?
Well, I'm rooting for that Curtis Mayfield.
Yeah. But you know what I mean. So it's like I'm pretty spoiled for a subject matter that and the fact that a book was a success. Now it's like I should just do one and done and never write another book.
We kind of felt that way about the legendary Stardust Cowboy. There was nothing out there about him. There was hardly any pictures. There was hardly nothing. And honestly, the trek that it took for us to even finish that thing was just. Our house got broken into and all of our equipment got stolen halfway through, so we had to finish it by borrowing other people's equipment, and it was just a big mess. And then by the time we did get it finished, I think it was a long fucking time. 6 months after we finished it, all this shit started happening. David Bowie covered.
Right.
I took a trip on Heathen, and then he invited him out to the festival out in the Meltdown Festival out in London, and then he got invited to the Highline Festival in New York, both of them with Daniel Johnston.
Right.
And then we're like, God damn it.
Right.
We didn't want to start over. We didn't want to redo it. And we couldn't afford it anyway because the Laugh-In people had caught up.
Oh, right. So. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to make this story really short, but I stole that Laugh-In footage from him, okay? Because when we first met the Ledge, one of the reasons we went out there was just to talk to him. I wanted to see what he looked like. I just wanted to figure out what his shit was. And we just recorded like 2 hours of him talking. And at the end of it, we were like, holy shit, this is a story.
Right.
But we wanted to see that Laugh-In footage because, it was legendary that he was on Laugh-In.
Right.
And he's like, I don't have it. I'm like, well, why not? He said, they won't give it to me.
Right.
And we thought that was kind of shitty.
Right.
They're like going, what the hell, man? He was on your show. Let him have the. So when I got home, I wrote a letter, or I called George Schlatter's office, and the secretary says, you can't get it. And I was like, well, why not? And she says, well, he's a nice guy and everything, but he just generally says no to everything because he feels that eventually it's going to be worth something. It is. Right. I said, okay, look. I said, if I write him a letter, would you at least show it to him? And she says, okay, fine. So I wrote him this letter, telling him I was his college student. and I was doing my thesis on atonality in modern pop culture. And I wanted to draw a line from Stravinsky to Stockhausen through Terry Riley all the way up to the legendary Stardust Cowboy. And I said, I really need this clip for the presentation. I'm like, this could be my grade. I said, my parents have spent so much money on my college education. I'm working 2 jobs. I said, I won't do anything with it, I promise. Could I just have this clip for my presentation? My grade, my
future depend on it, right?
Yeah. About a week later, this box shows up, and it's got a 3-minute VHS tape with that footage on it.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I call up the lads, and I go, hey lads, I got your laughing footage. And I thought he'd be like, oh man, great, thanks, what? And he goes, okay. He's not nonplussed is the best way to describe him. I mean, if he found out that Anne Margaret, age 25, was naked in the next room, he'd still go, okay. Yeah. So I'll send you a link to the documentary. You can watch it on
I've seen it.
Yeah, and he's like I say, it's kind of nowadays it kind of looks a little bit amateurish because the equipment we use was like what
before everybody had a high def thing on their phone. Yeah.
If we could go back with our phones, it would look great.
You want me to conclude by saying something?
Actually, I got one more thing I was going to ask you, and that is since you work in the newspaper business, now I saw the last season of The Wire. It didn't look pretty. How unpretty is it these days?
Well, I've kind of always existed in my own little island, and as I say here in Memphis, music is not a disposable kind of thing. It's like, our economy is based on it, our identity is based on it. So for me, the job definitely has shifted and changed. Some of that is I've written a lot of the Memphis stories I wanted to, so now it's more about I think music business to a certain extent. Like it's shifted. I still do pure arts coverage and show previews and concert reviews and things like that, but I'm doing more kind of I guess, news, trend, business type stuff. So that's really the only way it's changed for me. I mean, the business itself obviously has changed tremendously, but we are in these nice new offices, so that's good.
I was going to say, yeah, really nice digs.
I mean, we were in a beautiful building that was beautiful in the 60s and 70s, and then, and it was starting to fall apart and crumble because, it was occupied by a third of the number of people, or 2/3 less people. So, and I've been lucky in that, just covering stuff in Memphis is still always very interesting. It's a heritage music city, it's a legacy music city, and that's a lot of what I'm into. So I still get to do and see great things, and it's just an amazing city to live in, and the things that come through and the things that happen here. So it's for me, I've been lucky, probably one of relatively few people who has been doing this as long and seen as many changes in the industry that sort of is relatively unaffected and still very happy, kind of doing what he's doing.
Yeah, this is one of my 3 favorite cities. I always tell people there are 3 cities that if I could live in any of the 3 other than the one I live now, I would. So
yeah, it's a great place.
Okay, the last thing I'll talk to you about, the Don't Tell a Soul deluxe package. Do you think in the future there might be more of those?
Well,
this one does well.
Yeah,
I assume it will.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hoping. The first one we did was live at Maxwell's, which came out a couple years ago, and the response to that was pretty overwhelming. I mean, I think that was so necessary because it's like so much of the Replacement's reputation is based on their live show, and there hadn't really been a high quality, and that was a multi-track, 24-track done by the F&L Mobile unit that did the Who and Springsteen and all these kind of people.
That's got the incarcerated.
So I'm talking about the 2017 thing. So this new one is with the Bob Stinson lineup. So that was like a great thing. That did really well enough that we thought we'd be a little bit more ambitious with the second release in this sort of unofficial series. And so it's called Dead Man's Pop, and it's kind of a reimagining of the Don't Tell Soul album era. It includes the kind of a remix or the originally intended mix of the album done by the producer Matt Wallace. Includes a disc of rarities, again mostly unreleased, that includes the first session and attempt to make the record at Bearsville with Tony Berg, and then a bunch of other stuff with Matt, and then kind of highlights from a one-night session they did with Tom Waits, and then the last 2 discs in the package are the live Incarcerated concert, which is from '89 from that Don't Tell a Soul tour, of which 4 songs had been out on a promo EP, but there's 30 songs in that show that nobody's ever heard, never been bootlegged. So it's a really, it's like 70 songs, I think 68 unreleased.
Yeah, it's a beautiful package. Yeah. I would hope there would be.
Yeah, so part of, like I said, it's kind of an outgrowth. I mean, it was just sort of a thing of like, hey, listen guys, I've put in the years researching this stuff, and have the kind of institutional knowledge at this point of what's there and what we can do with it. And so let's do it. And so I've been lucky enough that Rhino Records and Warner Brothers Reissue Arms kind of partnered up or let me kind of produce or co-produce these things and kind of direct it a little bit along with Jason Jones, who was their new A&R guy for the replacements down there. So it's been good. So the first one did really well, Live at Maxwell's. This one will be probably out by the time this airs, and so hopefully if this does well enough, we'll keep doing them. So.
Well, I'm a sucker for packages like this. I assume you saw the one the Kinks did for Village Green, right? I mean, you could just keep opening that thing for like 10 minutes. I mean, there's like, oh look, there's a postcard, there's some singles, oh look at this.
Yeah, my buddy Andrew Sandoval had a big hand in that, and he does a lot of the Kinks stuff.
They're kind of my baby.
Oh yeah. Now the Arthur one, I haven't seen it yet, but it's supposed to be
really
great.
I haven't either, but I know it's coming. It's not on pre-order yet. So if I remember correctly, Village Green.
They are doing a thing because I know they're doing an event for it, launch event in London here pretty soon. So I'm sure it'll be. It's one of those things might just be a little later than expected.
That's what I'm thinking. Well, because when the White Album one came out, which I assume you've seen, was also a gorgeous package. The Village Green one came out, I think, about a month before or a month later.
Right.
So I'm figuring Arthur will probably be like
right.
And and that's not a lot of people's favorite Kinks record.
Right.
But it is mine for sure. It's one that as time has grown, and you listen to something like Some Mother's Son or Australia, and you realize that he's telling stories literally from his living room.
Right.
I don't think anybody realized it at the time. They just thought, oh, he's another concept album.
Right.
But I think Arthur is probably the most personal record he ever put out.
Right. Yeah.
And I just love the songs from beginning to end.
No, it's a kind of it can hurt your wallet, but it's a pretty golden era for like this stuff because I think people realize there's a generational thing and there's a format thing, and so like people are like, well, if we're gonna do this, let's do it right as possible, as luxury as possible, as deep as possible.
And also because the people buying are mostly like 60-year-old dudes like me who may have. It's like that new Bruce Springsteen CD. I think it was like, shot to number one because people
still buy.
People my age don't know how to download it. So,
Well, we had that with, honestly, with the replacements. We sold a lot of, fair amount of vinyl on the first one on Live at Maxwell. We sold an almost equal amount of CDs, which almost, that's unprecedented or unheard of now anymore for any artist. But record companies like that, because that's real money in their pocket, and
they already own it.
And they already own it, and physical sales still count. So there's still a hungry audience that hasn't been overserved. And in the replacements case, they've been a little maybe underserved, and we're trying to rectify that. So hopefully we'll keep doing them.
Yeah, the price, I don't know if you noticed, but the price dropped on the Abbey Road one.
Right.
When I pre-ordered it, I think it was like $130, and I was like, I'm gonna have to drive some extra Uber that week to get some money, but then now it's dropped to like $88, which is far more reasonable.
Yeah, I mean they all, they have the suggested retail, and then you get all the online competitors, so they drop in the records.
It's the Gene Clark that I'm having a hard time with. I want it really bad, but I think it's only like 3 discs, and it's like really
it's expensive. Yeah, I love Gene Clark. Although I like White Light. That's kind of maybe my favorite.
I think my favorite still might be the first one.
First one, yep.
With the Gossip, and if you've
Gossip Brothers, yep, that's great.
If you've ever heard the expanded version that has like shitloads of different versions.
Okay, if you've gotten this far, then I thank you for listening. I would also like to thank Bob Mehr for being both a good guest and a very hospitable host. He took a couple hours out of his day to visit with a couple of strangers from out of state. I just want him to know that we really appreciate it. I think it made for a good show as well. Oddly enough, just this morning, there's a new piece on the By NWR website on Gary Stewart, written by Bob Mehr. I got about halfway through it already. I'm going to finish it after I get done recording this, and I would suggest you do the same. There's also a lot of unreleased tracks on here, some stories by some other people. If you don't know who Gary Stewart is, well, you should. I got turned on to Gary Stewart actually through my friend Dale, who lent me some records and showed me an article written by hopefully future guest Jim McDonough in the Village Voice, and I've been a big Gary Stewart fan ever since. So I've been spending most of the night looking around here, doing some reading, doing some listening, and you should too. Thank you for listening, and I will see you again next week.